Hello.
Hello, how's it going?
It's going great. Thank you for meeting to have this call with me.
Of course, not a problem. I do it to honor the Most High.
Of course. So I'm not entirely aware with all your material. Honestly, I just heard of you from when you had that kind of live stream casual debate the other week with
Yeah,
Southern Israelite.
yeah.
Right. So I guess since I don't know the entirety of your platform, if you wouldn't mind just giving me a very, very brief introduction to why you think that your theological understanding is the correct one.
Well, where would you like me to start? Why I believe the Quran, or the more particulars about like my rejection of the Hadith and that kind of thing? I guess I'll give a broad overview of my worldview. How about that?
Well, yes, worldview and why you reject the hadith for sure. That would be
Yeah.
what I meant.
Okay, so my name is Walid Naeem. I'm a Punjabi Pakistani man born and raised in Canada, and I I'm a Muslim, of course, but the big thing that differentiates me from the majority of people who call themselves Muslim is I reject the authority of the Hadith in total. And the reason I do that, I'm writing a book teaching this very thing, is that I believe that the Hadith is completely contradictory to the core Quranic message. Not only is the Hadith methodology, so their whole Usul al Hadith, their science of Hadith, their Isnad, not only is it nonsense from a logical standpoint, but it is completely incompatible with the Quran. The Quranic stance is unapologetically sola scriptura if you read it carefully, and that's what I seek to present in my new coming book, which may be out in the next few months if the Lord wills. Also, I'm a flat earther as well. Flat earther, I wrote a 1,200-page encyclopedia on the issue of the flat earth. You can find it for free on my YouTube channel. It's in the description of every one of my videos. It's called the Flat Earth Encyclopedia, and I think it's the most comprehensive, detailed rendition of this subject out there. I think I've encompassed pretty much every point of it.
Excellent. Thank you very much for that introduction.
Yeah,
So I'll give you my introduction as well.
yeah,
So my name is not actually Jim, but Geopolitics is the alias that I go for.
yeah,
And I've been a part of the Christian theologian amateur apologetics genre, I guess you could say, on YouTube for the past 2 years. I've always been someone who I consider myself to be wanting the truth above all else. I don't consider myself to be someone who is defending my religion merely because it is the product of my upbringing or part of what my parents had given me. Thus, I find myself somewhat involved with the Southern Israelite and many of his friends and colleagues in my pursuit of the truth. I'm not any official colleague of the Southern Israelite. Like, I'm not a business partner of his or anything. I'm inquiring into his belief system and his particularly what I'm interested in is his theological beliefs concerning the Bible. As for the
yeah.
political and other issues, those are not really my concern. Although I do appreciate your enthusiasm for the flat Earth, to which I fully agree with you, and I think that I'm not entirely familiar with how the Quran presents the flat Earth, but I know from my own experience, the Bible certainly does. So
Oh,
as of
so
this stage, I'm
so
kind
you
of inquiring.
you believe that the Bible more or less teaches a geocentric flat Earth model?
I believe that it teaches the model as purported by the Southern Israelite with the firmament and the flat Earth. Yes.
Oh wow, that's an interesting point, and I wonder, are you like an official member of the Orthodox Church?
No, actually, because I was baptized as a Roman Catholic and then in the process of chrismation into Orthodoxy. So I guess you could say yes, but there are many things that I disagree with, and they're kind of recent beliefs. So, which is why I'm tentative to say that I'm fully a part of Drake's platform or not. I'm still looking into it, but from what I've researched, given his material and the other material out there, I find it more difficult, or sorry, it's more difficult to understand the plausibility of what the mainstream media and most, I guess, of the organized religions are saying about the model of the earth. I'm not entirely 100% sure, but in my inquiring phase into Drake's platform, I find the flat earth to be one of the more convincing elements for certain.
Okay, yeah. Well, if you are interested, Lord willing, some other time you can read my book. It's available for free, and I
I
have a
will read
full
it.
section dedicated to the Bible and the Quran, the Quranic and biblical testimony, and I think, it's one of the more comprehensive presentations on the internet on the subject.
Excellent. I believe you. So the reason I called this meeting here is because in the recent discussion you had with Drake and Callisto Theist, who goes by the name of Hans as well, you guys seem to be discussing, I believe the first half of the debate was Hans was debating with you whether or not the Quran teaches Neoplatonism. And I
Yes.
believe the concept was the soul, which you were comparing to the breath of life concept in the Tanakh and the New Testament of the Bible, and saying
Yeah.
that it was the equivalence is found in the Quran. Again, I'm not 100% familiar with the Quran, and my Arabic is not perfect. So, what, if anything, does the Quran teach about this soul or breath of life? What have you discovered?
My understanding of the soul, or the nafs, if we're going to use the word of Arabic, is that it is essentially, how do I word it? It's referring to the free-willed, free agent individual at its most foundational level. It's not some disembodied ghost that's inside of you which inhabits your physical body. Never does the Quran even use the word immaterial or non-material or incorporeal. The entire corpus of the Quran and narrative, the paradigm is of a physical reality. That's my understanding. I approach the Quran with that materialistic worldview. And the soul is just interchangeable for the individual. That's it.
Okay,
Even there's a
because
verse. There's even a verse in the Quran where what was it? It's something that it goes to the effect of, I can pull it up for you, where
sure.
and it's relevant to this discussion because you're a Christian. God is asking Jesus, did you say anybody? And this is on Judgment Day. He's going to ask Jesus, did you tell anybody to worship you or your mother? And
Is
he
this
said
Surat
no.
al-Ma'idah?
I'm not. I don't remember the exact citation, but you can check that one after. But he says, I never told anybody to worship my mother or me, and if I did it, you would have known it. You know what is in my soul, God, and I don't know what's in your soul." So God Himself, quote unquote, has a soul, but it's not this ghost. It's just referring to God as, again, a free-willed individual, free agent individual.
I see. Okay, yeah, because in the Bible, the concept for soul, or what is translated as soul, is really more akin to a breath of life. So the soul is kind of the existence itself within man, but it's not some incorporeal, immaterial ghost
Yeah,
residing
nefesh.
within a body. Yeah, it's not that kind of concept which you find either in later developments amongst the church or even in non-Christian apologetics like Neoplatonism, and some of the Greek philosophers had this immaterial idea. And that brings me to my next question.
Yeah,
The issue of transcendence or transcendental. You said you were a materialist, so, and this is kind of a heavy question,
yeah.
but on Drake's platform, there is the strong belief that the Bible teaches that God exists in a geographical location, like one location at a time. He isn't wrapping around the entire universe. And he is a physical being. Doesn't mean flesh and blood, but that he does have some kind of a form.
He's a
What is your
concrete entity.
Yes,
Yeah.
what is your understanding? Is God transcendental according to the Quran, or does he have a some kind of a finite form?
According to the overwhelming Quranic testimony, God is not a transcendental abstraction. He is a physical, concrete, corporeal being who sits on his throne above the dome of the flat earth. And I have a copious amounts of verses I can show you to substantiate that.
I actually believe you because I used to have a lot of dialogue with a variety of Muslims online, and in particular, there was always this notion, at least from the Christian perspective, that it was the Salafis that had too much of a literalist interpretation of like God's hands and so on, even though they say it's nothing like a human's hand. And so it was interesting to see the dichotomy or the difference between that and the normative Sunni belief, which is that God is extremely transcendental. Where do you think this idea that God is so transcendental that he can't even communicate in the manner that we would be able to understand? All these kind of transcendental ideas, where in Islam, I'm saying, not in your worldview, where does that come from? Why does the nominal Sunni believe in something like that?
I think largely because they have had a history and a tradition of this, and really these things started to creep into the, for want of a better term, Islamic world, Arab world. It started to creep into it after these Arab intellectuals started to translate a lot of these Greek philosophical texts and studying them. Then they wrote their works, and obviously these people, they're very respected in the Sunni tradition. They started to write their works and strain the Quran through this kind of Hellenistic Greek metaphysical understanding. And they wrote their works, and then that just kind of established itself in their tradition.
I
That's where I
see.
would explain it.
Well, it would be very similar to the explanation that Drake and Hans would give on their platform that, the original apostles and the Bible itself teaches materialism, flat earth, and not the Trinity. Obviously, they don't believe in the concept of the Trinity, and
Yeah.
that these are later things that come about because some of the church fathers were respected intellectuals, but because they were melding with Greek philosophy and Neoplatonism, it kind of unintentionally found itself in the religion. So you'd have kind of a similar view.
Yeah, these Al-Ghazali type of guys in the Sunni tradition, they've almost become like the church fathers of them. They have almost like unquestioned authority. And of course, I guess it would vary depending on who you talk to, but they've established themselves as an authority for sure.
That's what I thought. I used to not know much at all about Islam until maybe 2 years ago. And as I started to research more, I saw that there was a wide chasm between what I could say are Quran purists, but not entirely Quranists like you are yourself. There
Yeah,
are some Sunnis I've met who are like 90% Quran with a little bit of supplementary Hadith. So they recognize that a lot of the Hadith has been blown out of proportion and idolized too much, and it goes away
absolutely.
from the theology of the Quran. There's a channel called Quranic Islam, I think, on YouTube, and he's one of these. He only has like a little bit of Hadith he accepts, but he's not a full-blown Quranist. So I've seen a lot of those recently. But I did want to ask you, and this is more of a historical question.
Yeah.
So maybe I'm sure you know what it is, but maybe it's not like your specialty. So when it comes to the Sauds, the Saud dynasty, from what I've read on the biography of Ibn Saud and his forefathers, is that the formation of Wahhabism was essentially kind of a reformation in Arabia against what they saw as too many innovations in the Ottoman-controlled Islamic world. Would you say that they were kind of correct on that and on the right path, but that they deviated in an incorrect way? Or what's your view on these, what people call the Wahhabis?
Honestly, I'm going to say that I have almost no knowledge on the Wahhabi sect, so you would
Okay.
probably even know more than me considering you've done a little research.
Yeah, essentially their whole thing is that they were in Najd in Saudi Arabia, and Ibn Saud, the political leader of the Saud tribe, partnered with Ibn Abd al-Wahhab, and he was essentially one of these reformers based on, I think, Ibn Taymiyyah, who was saying, oh, the Turks have added too much. Number one, the position of the caliph is like too close to idolatry, so we're not going to do that. And number two, we got to stop with the praying to the saints nonsense, or praying at saintly tombs and shrines.
Yeah,
Um,
the whole
this
idea of Muhammad interceding for you and all this kind of stuff,
Yeah,
it's
they
crept
hated
in.
intercession, which is why there are a lot of stories online of Sunnis from like Malaysia or Turkey or part of North Africa. They go to Saudi Arabia with like these kind of not like original relics, but like cheap copies of relics that they think are kind of these like intercessionary items. And when they get there, they have like the religious police of the Wahhabi sect, which would like destroy them and say this is idolatry. So they're definitely a lot different than most of the Sunni world. That's why I thought I'd ask. But so I have another topic to ask you about, if you don't mind.
No, no worries.
Okay, so I guess you obviously know more about the Hadith. Why is it that, can you give me some specific examples? You don't need to use like a specific verse or anything, but what is the general problem of the Hadith? I know you said it strays from the Quranic theology. How does it do so? What are they implementing that wasn't there in the original scripture? Or how do they completely change how they interpret the original scripture, like the tafsir and stuff like that?
My main problem with the hadith, of course, you can bring up logical problems and suspicions with respect to how these oral traditions have been transmitted, but my main problem is it contradicts the Quran. And that is the Quran, and I have, like I said, even if you want, we can go through all the verses. I have it in my book, but the Quran, God says very clearly that it is complete, it is clear, it is perfect, and it is the only source of guidance that believers need in their life. If you ask the nominal Sunni or the nominal Shia, you ask them, okay, do we need the hadith as part of our faith? Is our faith incomplete without it? And they will say, yes, we need the hadith. Without it, your faith is incomplete. Well, I find it conspicuous that there is, and this is a fact, there is no explicit, not a single explicit verse within the entirety of the Quran mentioning that there, after the Prophet Muhammad died, there's going to be this oral tradition passed down, and eventually it's going to be compiled later by guys like Imam Bukhari and Imam Muslim, and that this is going to form part of our faith, completely missing from the Quran and actually contradictory to it, because to think that the Quranic law, the Quranic legal system, is incomplete without the hadith, because in the hadith we get all these laws that are not in the Quran, like men can't wear gold, men can't wear silk, women can't show their hair, all these kinds of things. You are presupposing the Quran itself is incomplete and it needs to be aided by this hadith law, which is contradicting the Quran's own statement. So that would be my main issue. The Quran claims to be complete.
Okay. I would also posit, and again, this is from the Christian perspective, so maybe my idea of it is slightly warped, trying to be unbiased, at least when I look at this point of it.
Yeah.
From what I've seen, and I haven't read a lot of Hadith, mainly Sahih al-Bukhari, and from what I've seen, comparing the Hadith to the character presented of the Prophet Muhammad in the Quran, it seems like, you can correct me if I'm wrong, maybe you'd agree, it seems like these are almost two completely different people. I mean, it seems like the Prophet presented in the Quran is this humble guy, excuse my limited language on this subject, but he's this humble guy who receives the revelation from God, he gives it to the people, and one of the primary themes is do not do association or shirk. Do not commit idolatry, obviously, but also association is very heavily mentioned in the Quran, especially when it comes to Jesus. Those are polemics against the Christian concepts of the Trinity. But it almost seems like when you get to the Hadith, at least these guys who are very obsessed with the Hadith, you'll find that the status of Muhammad is raised to a level that ironically almost seems like association. I'm not saying he's a god or anything,
They
but the
have this
fact
very exalted Muhammadology, if we will.
that's the exact word I've used, and people would ask me if I'm crazy, but this is what I meant, because Sunnis were always attacking the Christians. And I'd say, of course, you guys don't have a Trinity or anything, but why is it that your prophet is saying in some hadiths, don't do to me what the Christians did to Jesus, and then in others you have these people falling all over themselves trying to mimic how he like trimmed his cuticles and stuff. It seems like it's going a little too far for the
This
prophet of the Quran, which is giving a very simple message of avoiding shirk and idolatry. Am I
it's
correct or wrong?
I'm very very happy you mentioned that, Jim, because I actually just in the book that I'm writing, I just completed that portion of the book today, but even just earlier today
Wow.
before this call, where I'm talking about how it's conspicuous that two Muhammads have seemed to have arisen from history. One is the Muhammad of the Hadith, which is totally different from the Muhammad of the Quran, and I go to describe the differences. So I 100% agree with you. In the Quran, Muhammad is a humble man. He is nothing special among the messengers. And in the Quran, it hardly even focuses on Muhammad in the first place. This is
That's what I
something I
thought.
this is something I talk about in my book. It's when these Western Orientalist scholars, they start to go to the East and study the religions of the East, one of the names they actually came up for people who call themselves Muslims, they called them Mohammedans. Why did they call them Mohammedans? They called them Mohammedans because these people are obsessed with the name Muhammad. It was the defining characteristic of their religion, which is why Orientalists named them Mohammedans. But if you look actually at the Quran, if I'm not mistaken, the Quran only mentions Muhammad by name 4 times. That is it. And then a few extra times as under the title of the Prophet and the Messenger. The Quran does not focus on Muhammad at all. We know almost nothing about Muhammad. It's the entire perspective of the Quran is God speaking to mankind. And God is telling us the truth of his oneness and the judgment day. And it mainly actually the most mentioned prophet in the Quran is Moses, and second is Jesus. So,
Right.
even in terms of real estate that's taking it up in the Quran, Muhammad ranks almost at the bottom. Muhammad is also, as well, corrected in the Quran. He's chided for his mistakes. God corrects him. Whereas Jesus, there's no mistake or correction ever made for him or by him through God. God never makes any corrections of Jesus. He's been wise and righteous since day one when he was born. So this whole religion which exalts Muhammad in really a false idea they have Muhammad in their mind, like, oh, my prophet, the holy prophet. This is anathema to the Quranic message, which hardly
This
even
is
focuses on him.
this is one of the issues. Excellent explanation. This is one of the issues that so many Christians and Muslims have, and I used to be sucked into this circle as well. The constant debating, the back and forth, and I did always find it a little hypocritical. But the reason that so many Christians get turned off by the idea of Islam is because, Muslims are presenting this idea that Christians go overboard with Jesus, which we already covered. But then,
Yeah.
as you accurately state, when these Orientalists are showing up in the East, it's nonstop saying Muhammad's name every 5 seconds. Everyone on earth is named after him. Maybe I'm exaggerating a little bit. And the religion mentions him all the time in the prayers. And we got to cut our hair X, Y, and Z way. Now, obviously, we have similar laws like that in the Torah, but you'll never see Christians or even rabbinic Jews walking around treating Moses with the level that, or even like Torah following people like Drake, obviously, none of them will treat Moses the level that at least the Sunnis treat Muhammad. And so it was always kind of an issue because it looked like it strayed really far away from this kind of biblical narrative. When you look at the Quran by itself and you ignore the Hadith, which many times I was kind of in a phase where I was trying to decide what was the true religion, I
Yeah.
would look at Islam and I would go, there's a lot here that looks, tangible. It looks decent. I understand why there's the polemics against the Trinity and everything. But then I see the behavior of the normal Sunni. I'm like, there's no way that God would send this religion to replace the idolatry of the Trinity,
When it has the
quote,
same
quote,
characteristics.
when it has something similar here, right? So when you look at the Quran, you're right. If you take away all the kind of flair of the East and you just kind of read it in, let's say we give it to a Westerner, read it in English, and you don't tell them it's the Quran, you remove all the Arabic, kind of transliterated Arabic from it, they may not even know whether this is the Quran or the Old Testament if they're not too learned, because most of the book is dealing with the prophets and the Israelites, right? So
Yeah.
it's then you have the actual religion of Sunni Islam. It's like no one, we don't mention the prophets that much. It's just all this. Here's the story of what Muhammad did when he went to the carnival at age 9, for example. So I think it goes way overboard. I would agree with you on that.
Yeah, I mean the Hadith is unbelievable. Like it has whole supposed, and I don't believe in any of this stuff because the way the Hadith has been compiled, there's no way to determine whether it's true or false. It's all just word of mouth, oral transmissions, and what it says about Muhammad, it goes into such detail about his appearance, the way he did his beard, the sexual sprees he would have with his wives. Like, why are we so obsessed with Muhammad? Let's just read the Quran for a moment. Does it place that kind of emphasis on Muhammad? Not at all. The center focus of the Quran, the apple of the Quran's eye, as it were, is God Almighty and the oneness of God.
Right. And that's one of the problems I always had when discussing with these Sunnis because, and you can check this out online. I don't think you think I'm lying, but there are many Muslim apologists who, when they say Muhammad, they'll say Sallallahu Alaihi Wasallam, but then they say God or Allah, they say nothing after. They don't say blessed be he or anything.
My wife
So
points that out to me all the time. She says these people pour blessings and honorifics more on Muhammad's name than they do to God Almighty.
they really do. Even some of the bigger apologists like Ijaz Ahmed and like some of these convert guys who are on the internet, they're always saying Sallallahu Alaihi Wasallam, but then they don't really say Subhanahu wa Ta'ala as much. It's kind of weird. It's like, what are you doing here? I thought this was the oneness religion.
Yeah,
So
I
obviously,
remember I was talking to a Djibouti lady. She was a common Sunni Hadith follower, an old Djibouti lady. You know Djibouti, right? That little
yeah,
country in Africa.
Horn of
Yeah,
Africa, yeah.
yeah, yeah. I was talking to her and I was relaying to her my understanding of the Quran, that I follow God alone. And basically, I don't say peace be upon him every time I say Muhammad because I don't see that commandment in the Quran. It's just kind of silly to me. But every time I would say God, she wouldn't say anything. But even when I would say the name Muhammad, she would just whisper to herself, Sallallahu Alaihi Wasallam, Sallallahu Alaihi Wasallam, peace be upon him. Like
Yeah,
she would whisper it to herself, like almost cult-like, but never with
yes.
God.
I always thought that was absolutely deranged, and especially, you know, I'm glad we're talking about this. I was actually unsure whether you followed that practice. You said you did it sometimes, but not like after every uttering, obviously, because it is a little strange. Like even when they're
No, no, I don't.
discussing
I
the,
don't pour honorifics on Muhammad's name after I mention
oh,
his
okay.
name. No.
Because there are some people who, when they're doing debates, they'll go, guys, Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam is no different than any of the other prophets like Ibrahim or Jesus, and they say nothing after their names. I know they're supposed to say alayhi wasalam, but they don't say it sometimes, many times, but they will say it with Muhammad. It's really kind of strange. And these are the same people who say, hey, don't associate. So I always found that to be extremely hypocritical.
Yeah. Well, you're dealing with, if I'm going to use the words of the wonderful author Aidid Safar, we're dealing with an Arab religion. That's what we're dealing with. It's not actually true Islam as espoused by the Quran.
It's interesting you would mention that because when you say Arab religion, and this is going to be from my perspective here as an Arab
Yeah.
non-Muslim, it actually seems almost like, and I know that Islam is a very Arab-focused religion, but it actually seems almost like the kind of more to the Arabic root would be the Quran itself and the recitation. And a lot of these hadiths, even though it's about an Arab prophet, a lot of them are, if I'm not mistaken, compiled by and recited by and the tradition passed down by people
Persians.
who are geographically, yeah, I was trying to put it lightly, but without naming the finger, but I would say mainly Persians or people in the Persian sphere, like Afghanistan maybe. So it seems like this area is kind of the wing of the tradition, and then some of the other innovations would be like from the Ottomans, so the Turks. But when you actually have what actually came out of Arabia, which is why I mentioned the Sauds earlier, because they always had, like, obviously they loved their hadith as well, which is kind of ironic, but they
Yeah.
always had an issue with like this shrine stuff, which is why you always hear about the Saudis bulldozing, like, oh look, there's the Prophet's bathroom, and they'll blow it up, because people would go there and start throwing themselves at the object and like throwing flowers and stuff. Like, what? I thought this was supposed to be no idolatry. So they always had an issue with that. And the Saudis also almost lost my train of thought. Oh, I don't know if you knew, but the Crown Prince, Mohammed bin Salman, he recently said that like 90% of the Hadith is just tradition nonsense, and that we should be sticking mainly to the Quran. He
Yeah.
actually said that in an interview. He's like, yeah, we don't need these weird like culturally Islamic practices from Morocco and India. Like, we just need the Quran. We'll have the Hadith when we need them, but these guys who are obsessed with their tradition, it's got to stop. That was his main. He had a speech a couple of years ago where he said that. So that's why I was very interested in your platform and wanted
Yeah.
to talk to you. So now we've gotten that out of the way. I don't mean
Yeah.
to rant here, but I do want to talk about kind of the big issue, which is why I called the call in the first place.
Yeah.
So it seems like when you guys were talking, the first guy you're talking to is Hans. He's Arab. He used to be Muslim. He's now like a Nazarene, which is what the religion of Drake's platform is. And it almost seemed like, and maybe you'll correct me, but from my perspective watching, it seemed almost like both parties were kind of talking past each other because Drake is not like a master of Islam at all, and he admits that.
Yeah.
And it also seemed like a couple, maybe not all, but a couple of the arguments you were using would be better tailored toward a proper Trinitarian Christian, whereas Drake would agree with you that there are rampant corruptions in the text imposed by the Catholic Church. Do you think that there was some kind of like talking over each other or talking past each other in that discussion?
To a certain extent, I was trying to remain as civil as possible, but they were, kind of cutting me off and obfuscating from my point. And I was dealing with not just one person. I was dealing with multiple different strains of Christian-esque thought. Drake thinks one way. Then I was dealing with this other guy. I think his name was Hustle Bones online. That was his online name, and
Yeah, I
he's
don't
a
think that guy
Trinitarian.
was even a Nazarene. Yeah, there were
Yeah,
a couple people in there.
he's a Trinitarian, and they were even disputing amongst themselves. Like one of the guys, he was doubtful. I think that the Gospels were originally in Hebrew and Greek, or sorry, no, Hebrew and Aramaic, and then Drake was saying that that's what he believes. They were kind of even disagreeing among themselves. So I was dealing with different flavors of Christianity at one time.
Right. So, but you do understand, because I know that you're familiar with some of Drake's material. I mean, you do understand that Drake would rather be probably lit on fire than called a Christian. He really
Yeah,
disagrees with like 95% of all the anything outside of the Gospels. He will, or the whole New Testament itself. He will
I
disagree with all the church fathers on pretty much everything.
I would still call him a Christian, though. For my understanding, how he would define a Christian as somebody who follows the theology of the seven ecumenical councils. I would define a Christian as if you believe Jesus Christ is the Son of God who died on the cross for your sins, bled for your sins, and rose again in 3 days, you're a Christian. That to me is a Christian.
Right, yeah, the basic idea of one who's following the Christ of the New Testament, then yes. But obviously, he wouldn't use that language. So his terminology is Nazarene Jews. They do follow the law of the Torah, so the law of Moses, which
Yeah.
is kind of abrogated in Christianity, where, basically it's kind of almost like a Hebrew roots religion. I'm not sure if you're familiar who those
I,
guys are.
I've only heard a few mentions of the Hebrew roots through Drake and his criticisms of them, but I'm not too
Yeah.
familiar with the Hebrew
So the
roots.
Hebrew roots are basically kind of similar to what Drake's doing. No councils, no church fathers, no Trinity, no like nothing outside of the Bible. Plus, I think most of them try to follow the law of Moses. So it's similar to Drake, but there are a few disagreements here and there. So
Like
they do fall.
a sister group almost.
Yeah, like Drake and Hans would both say that, all these Hebrew roots guys, of which there are a few million, they're compatible with our theology. They just have to be corrected on a few things. That's what they
Yeah.
would say. But yeah, so they follow the law of Moses on Drake's platform. They're essentially just like, basically their perspective is that Jesus came to continue Judaism and give us the completion of it, not start some new kind of a religion.
Yeah.
Now, based on everything you've seen in your familiarity with the Bible, what is the reason that you don't accept either Christianity or this Nazarene Christianity or the Bible itself? What are some of your issues with it?
Great question, great question. And I'll actually tell you, so years ago, so when I'm 22 now, when I was 14 years old, I came to the belief that I believe the Quran and I'm going to follow this book for the rest of my life. I made my oath. And I had a choice. I either could have become a Christian or I could have become a Muslim. And I was very tempted to become a Christian. I wanted to because a lot of the people who I was listening to online on the internet, a lot of this like online conspiracy sort of anti New World Order, most the people who are preaching this message, they're Christians, and I wanted to be like them, but I couldn't become a Christian due to a few logical inconsistencies I see in their religion. So I'll tell you what brought me towards Islam as opposed to Judaism and Christianity.
Oh, can I just ask one thing really quick? Were
Yeah,
you
go for it.
raised in a religious household or irreligious?
Kind of not. So
Same here.
my mother is religious, yes. My mother, she follows the Quran. And actually, interestingly enough, the rejecting Hadith, it almost kind of runs in my family to a certain extent. My broader family, like my cousins and them, they're all nominal Sunnis. But my mother, she, like, I never grew up hearing about Hadith in my household. I just grew up hearing about the Quran. And yes, my mom, I think she retains some practices, like the five daily prayers. These things come from the Hadith, not the Quran. But she doesn't acknowledge the Hadith as an authority, and she knows it's one of the main problems within Islam. And her father as well, he was actually a Quran alone Hadith rejecter back in Pakistan. He was known for that
Oh,
as well.
interesting.
And interestingly enough, as well, I came across the Quran alone position and started to reject the Hadith only later in my life. After I came to that position, then I started to learn from my mom that actually my grandfather was like this as well. So both him and I kind of came to this independently. So it almost seems to run in the blood.
That's very interesting. But yes, please go ahead on your issues with the Bible slash Christianity.
Yeah. So what, like, okay, I boiled things down because you know that the atheists they like to throw all this sand in your eyes. They try to say, you know, what about all the millions of religions in the world? I really boiled it down to okay, obviously the most superior faiths are Judaism, Christianity, and Islam. I don't need to convert to some strange sect of Hinduism
You
in
don't want to do
some
Jainism? Why
no,
not?
yeah, Jainism, some sect of Jainism in the middle of nowhere in the Indian subcontinent. No, no. The most superior religions is Judaism, Christianity, and Islam, this biblical, Quranic thing. And what turned me off to Judaism is I accept that these people, generally speaking, are monotheists. I have a great amount of respect for the Karaite Jews, so long as they don't insult the Prophet Muhammad and they don't insult Jesus, then I have great respect for them. But what turned me off was basically Judaism. I can see when I read the Old Testament, a lot of it is it has retained a lot of the history of the ancient Israelites. So there's a lot of place names, a lot of people's names, a lot of bloodlines, all these things which frankly they're not relevant to me. And if we are to follow a faith, we're obviously going to follow that which is relevant to us. This is very clearly a product of its time and its history. The people back then would have known it, but I don't know these things, so I don't really feel like it's for me. And then as for Christianity, the reason why I reject it is I see it as a 180-degree turn from what the Old Testament has taught. And then finally, when I read the Quran, it has the monotheism, which I respect in Judaism, but it doesn't have all this racial, historical baggage that comes with it. When I read a faithful translation of the Quran, I genuinely feel like it is pertinent to me, that the message is for me. So that's why I chose the Quran.
I see. So, have you? I'm sure you've seen some of Drake's analysis of the New Testament. He would argue that he would agree with you that the Christian manner, so the nominal Christian manner of looking at the New Testament, would in fact be a 180 from the Tanakh, which is called the Old Testament.
Yeah.
But he would argue that if you actually read it in its pure context, without any presupposed baggage of Trinitarianism or getting rid of the law or the faith of the Gentiles or any of that kind of universalist kind of Christian thought, he would argue no, the New Testament is basically just doing kind of a of reformation of the rabbinic thought. So the Jews, obviously, they're not just the Old Testament. They have the Talmud, at least the rabbinics, not the Karaites.
Yeah.
And these Jews have a lot of traditions in the Talmud. The Talmud is basically like their Hadith. It just goes wildly out of nowhere and has nothing to do with the actual Tanakh. And that's where you get some of the really weird Jewish beliefs from, plus the Kabbalah and a million other things.
Yeah.
But he would argue that, if you actually read the Gospels, Matthew and Mark especially, Jesus' main polemic against these Jews is not, hey, you guys got to accept the Trinity now, or stop doing the law. His main polemic is you're adding rabbinic tradition, the law of men, over the law of God. So he's kind of reforming them back to the law of Moses. That's
It's
Drake's perspective.
it's almost like I guess, and I'm not comparing myself to Jesus, but it's almost like the same tradition I follow along. I'm trying to tell the people who call themselves Muslim to come back to the law of God as opposed to the traditions of men which have developed afterwards.
Right. So that would be how Drake and his whole platform would see the Bible. And it's not like he's pulling this out of nowhere. I mean, a lot of the text, especially like Mark 7, the famous chapter about thus he declared food clean, that's not actually in the Bible. That's kind of a bracket that was added later. But in the more honest translation, it's basically just him saying, your hand washing ritual is not mentioned in the law of Moses, so I don't need to do it with my disciples before we eat because you're adding something onto the law of God where there wasn't. And same applies to the episode where he and his disciples go to pluck grain on the Sabbath, and the
Yeah.
Pharisees are like stalking him the entire time in the Gospels. They go, oh, that's it, you disobeyed the Sabbath. And Jesus says, no, not really. David did the same thing. So you're the one actually being ridiculously extreme with your ordinances, more extreme than God is. And so Drake would argue that, Peter, Paul, and all the others are basically just teaching to keep doing the law. So do you think Drake's wrong on that, or do you still think that even if
Uh,
you agree with that, there's other beliefs in the New Testament that are incompatible with the Tanakh or your
yeah.
own view?
I would more or less agree with Drake on that. I think the original man, flesh and blood man who walked the earth, Jesus, he was his main contention was with all of these man-made accretions that made it into the way of their religion, as it were.
Right.
Yeah, he was dealing with these man-made traditions, these religious, and I have Quranic evidence to show that as well. But these religious doctors of the law, they started inventing all these practices which are not actually native to the Word of God.
Okay, so let me segue into this one then. How do you view the law that is described in Leviticus and Deuteronomy, which Moses received from God on Mount Sinai, comparing to the law that is espoused in the Quran? Do you think that the Quran is, kind of the final version of the law? Are there blatant issues with the Mosaic law of what you know?
I believe the Bible has vestigial remnants and a lot of good teachings within it that are the original Word of God. But I do think the ancient Jews, they did tamper with the text and add things which the Quran specifically condemns. For example, God says that interest is unlawful. No matter who takes from who, it's unlawful. But if I'm not mistaken, I think in the Old Testament it allows Jews to take interest from strangers. So, judging by
Yes.
my understanding of the Quran, this is an accretion. This is something that has been added in later on by them.
Okay. Let me ask. Sorry if I'm the one doing all the question asking. You can ask me a bunch after. I just have one more for you here,
I
and then
appreciate it. I like this.
I'd love to answer some of your questions as well. But this is kind of more of a, this is going to seem like kind of like an atheist question, but I just have to get it out of the way.
Yeah.
So when it comes to critical scholarship of the Quran, do you think that the Quran is more verifiable if we take away theology and we're just talking about where did these books come from? Is the Quran a very reliable book? And what do you think of these kind of crazy conspiracies like Dan Gibson, who thinks that the entirety of the Quran takes place in the Petra Valley of Jordan?
Oh, I agree with him. I don't believe that Muhammad is from Mecca. No
Oh,
way.
really? I didn't
Yeah.
know that. I'm
Yeah.
happy I brought that up.
Yeah.
Okay, well, that's definitely. I didn't mean to disparage it because I was assuming that you believed in the whole Saudi narrative there.
Yeah,
Why
you're
do you
kind of
think?
jocking my style a little bit there.
Sorry, man. The
It's
reason I
okay.
say that is because 99.9% of Muslims treat that guy like he's some insane nut. So you
Yeah.
actually agree with him that the kind of, I don't remember all the verses, but you would agree that the verses in the Quran about, I think there's some talking about like shepherding and livestock and vegetation that more describes like the Levant or kind of the Eastern Levant rather than the Hijaz.
I would go even further than that to say that I think there are major, major problems with the history we're told, not only with respect to the Quran and Muhammad, but the entire Bible as well. I don't even think that the story of Moses and Pharaoh, as it were, are really Fir'aun. I don't think these took place in what is called today Egypt. I don't think so.
Me neither. I think they took place in northwestern Saudi Arabia.
Yeah,
North northwestern near Jordan. So
yeah,
same.
this is known as the Egypt-Palestine thesis, and it's something, God willing, in the future I would like to even write a book on, summarizing it. There's been some wonderful books written on it, but I like to summarize it myself, and
Right.
that's a project I have in mind. I think there's serious problems with the mainstream geographies and histories we're given.
Right. So you would agree that, and correct me if I'm wrong, but correct me if I'm wrong in assuming you agree that they would have crossed to what is this? They crossed from today's Sinai Peninsula into northwestern Arabia, not Egypt proper into Sinai. When talking about Moses.
That I'm actually honestly not too sure of. All I remember from and I read these books years back, I just remember that the arguments they gave as to why Moses and that whole biblical narrative didn't take place in Egypt. I just remember the arguments were very solid, but I don't remember what the arguments that these people gave for the alternative, where they think this actually took place. I don't remember so much of that.
I
I'd have
have
to
for
go through the
you.
book.
Well, please let me know what you think of the book. But I do have for you a very good video, and you don't have to watch all of it. But
Yeah.
let me see where it begins. Yeah. Well, I'm gonna send you this link right now, just in the chat, and feel free to check it out whenever you have spare time.
Yeah.
So this is a very, very long video. Let me tell you the timestamp, because this is 3 hours long. So Red Sea crossing starts at, let me write it down, begins at 17 minutes. They do 30 minutes on why it should be in Arabia and not Egypt, not in the Sinai Peninsula, which is basically where the Greek Orthodox, they have a monastery there called St. Catherine's Monastery. And that this is one of those traditions where it's like, hey, we decide it's here, so it's here, but it doesn't really match the topography described in the Exodus account. But yeah, check that out when you have time. So
Yeah.
I really got to get into this Jordan thing. I watched Dan Gibson's documentary on it a long time ago. I don't remember all the details. Is he correct? Is what you're saying?
I would say the strongest evidence one can give for the birthplace of the historical Muhammad is Jordan. Yeah.
Is there a particular, is there one, I guess, what's the most glaring issue of this whole Saudi Arabia location?
If I recall correctly, I believe in the Quran it says that and I could let me actually pull up the verse just to make sure.
Okay.
Quran. Quran verse. Surah Al-Anfal. What's going on here? Yeah, I can't seem to find the verse right now. I guess my main issues or my main suspicions with Mecca is this black box that's there. It contradicts everything the Quran says about how we are to worship God, and I just see it as a later accretion that was built by the Arabs. A lot of my problems with the whole Mecca thesis is theological as well.
Okay, I see.
Yeah.
There's a lot of weird traditions from there. A lot of
Big
the Saudi
time.
authorities say, the Prophet Daniel's buried there, but he died in like northern Iraq, and like, how long would it take to get his corpse there? It's a lot of weird stuff that doesn't really, and also a lot of the kind of, not liberal scholars, but a lot of these kind of Protestant Christians online. I don't know if you know of this guy called Al-Fadi and what's his name? Dr. J. Smith. They're like obsessed with trying to prove that it wasn't in Saudi Arabia. They're not Muslims. And they
Yeah, I'm not
basically,
too familiar with them. I have heard the name Jay Smith, but I'm not so familiar with his work.
yeah, he's not a flawless guy, but he's a Christian basically trying to go, well, if I disprove it's in Saudi Arabia, Islam has to be false kind of person. So, but a lot of the things that they bring up, I'm not entirely familiar, or I'm not entirely familiar with all of the specificities of geography in the Quran, but some of them seem a little convincing. I think it was this scholar in the West, Yasser Qadi, who said something like, yeah, the standard Islamic narrative has holes in it. What do you think of those kind of statements? What's he talking about?
I think they're talking about the Islam, if we're going to call it that, the Islam that has its presuppositions based in the modern Egypt or the dominant Egypt-Palestine thesis. That has holes, surely.
Oh, okay.
Yeah. Well, actually, one thing that comes to my mind that makes me think there's problems with the histories we're given is the verse in the Quran, because I studied this stuff years ago, but it just came to me. There's a verse in the Quran where basically God is, he's calling the people of Muhammad to reflect on the civilizations that were destroyed before them, and he says basically, and he's talking about the civilization of Fir'aun, all these prophets that existed before, and he said you walk by them every single day. You walk by these cities that have been utterly destroyed by the Most High, and when was in Muhammad, let's say if he was in Saudi Arabia in Mecca, when was anybody in Mecca walking by the destroyed civilization of Fir'aun every single day?
Exactly. This is one of those verses, and I forget which surah and ayah it is, but I did hear that one before, and I thought that was extremely strange. I thought he also mentioned, correct me if I'm wrong, he was mentioning like Sodom and Gomorrah or the punishment of Sodom and Gomorrah in a verse like that, or maybe it was one of the lines
Yeah,
preceding.
yeah,
Yeah,
that as
so
well. That as
that
well.
takes place obviously in like the Palestine area. How could you be walking by that if you're in the middle of like Najd or Hijaz? It doesn't really make any sense.
It doesn't work.
So why then did they move it to Western Saudi Arabia? What was the purpose of that? This whole
Honestly, I
decision.
have no idea. That's a very interesting study I'd like to dive into. What were the motivations behind this? Surely, I think in the dominant Egypt Palestine thesis that there's a lot of vested political interests in it as well. But I'd have to dive further into that.
Right, because that's a very interesting one. Because if you look at all these early Muslim empires, none of them are making Mecca or Medina in Saudi Arabia their headquarters, not even theologically. Like they're all studying in Damascus and later Baghdad, and all the Abbasids had Baghdad, and then the Umayyads were based out of Damascus. Like, what are these guys doing? I thought that this Mecca and Medina were the most holy cities.
It's very
So
strange. Yeah, that's a good point. That the
like Arabia
earliest
is
history of
completely
the
ignored.
yeah the earliest history of the religion, it seems to be further east, a lot of it, than Saudi Arabia. In the
Right.
Iraq kind of area.
Yeah, like kind of more to the north, and then especially in like Mesopotamia, there's all these capitals and all the authority. It's very hard to understand, like, or sorry, it's very hard to find any kind of history outside of these first invasions that has anything to do with the peninsula, to be honest. It's a little strange how
It's tenuous.
it's like kind of this ignored region. Once the invasions happen, that's it. 99.9% of the history is just in like Syria and then later Turkey, and that's kind of it.
Yeah.
It is strange. So let's get into Neoplatonism, since that is something that both you and Drake agree is a very suspicious philosophy that creeped its way into two of the largest religions. Um, do you think that the Hadith teaches this concept of Neoplatonism throughout its many stories?
I don't think so. No, actually, I don't think the Hadith is predominantly Neoplatonist. I think that the Neoplatonist Hellenistic philosophy that's a later accretion that came after the Hadith, with some of
Okay.
these scholars and philosophers who were reading these Greek texts. I think the Hadith are predominantly materialist in their philosophy, the Hadith writings, because a lot of it is just kind of resurrected traditions from the ancient pagan Arabs, and I don't think they had this very sophisticated Neoplatonic philosophy. They were probably materialists.
So, what's your concept of a Jannah?
Jannah, it's according to the Quran. This when we die, we go to sleep in the earth and we're resting. And on the day of judgment, God will resurrect our bodies physically from the earth, and He will transform this earth into a new place, which will be the garden.
Well, it's extremely similar to Drake's position as well.
Yeah.
That there's you go to sleep, and then there's a resurrection. So it seems like in both you and Drake have a lot of similarities here in that the kind of wider nominal group you've escaped from has this idea of like a spiritual kind of transcendental paradise
Some ghost
floating.
realm floating in the middle of nowhere.
Yeah, like
Kind
I've
of this
seen a,
platonic realm.
right, I've seen like these videos by man, what's his name? Very generic Muslim channel. I forget the name, something believer or something like that. And they had a video where some sheikh was speaking. He's like, yeah, there's the seven heavens, and the distance between one to the other is like 500 light years, and that's not even the fingernail of God. And look how insignificant you are in this massive cosmos. It's like, what does this have to do with the Quran? Like, where's he getting this
Not even
from?
close. And here's the thing, the entire corpus of the Quran, when it describes heaven, as it were, I like the term garden because heaven is referring to the sky. When it describes a garden, when it describes the hellfire, everything is in physical terms. It's not like with the garden, our ghost is going to float up into this nice place. No, God says literally that there's going to be fruit that's growing. We're going to eat of the fruit, and we're going to say, hey, this is like what we ate on the earth when we were alive before. In our previous life, he
Right.
describes how we're going to have lawful, chaste spouses. He describes how we're going to be reclining on couches. We're going to have bracelets of silver and garments of silk. Everything is physical that God is describing. There's none of this Neoplatonic ghost metaphysical stuff.
Right, right. That's one of the main criticisms on the Southern Israelite platform that, this kind of going into this nether realm is not a concept in the Bible proper.
It's a
When
foreign
Jesus goes to
paradigm.
heaven, yeah, when Jesus goes to heaven, he physically, geographically goes upward into the sky. And then, like when Stephen is being martyred, he looks into the sky, And it's not like he's asleep. He's awake during this vision, and he just sees, the Almighty on a throne and Jesus at his side. And this is like as physical as you can get. He's not having some transcendental potion. You know what I mean? So, what about the concept of hell then? Because you debated this with, I don't know if it was Drake or Hans, but he was arguing that this was some kind of
A little bit of both,
incorporeal
I
hell.
think. A little bit
Yeah.
of both, yeah.
And you were saying no, it's physical.
Yeah, so it kind of the feud between Drake and I really goes back to he made a video with extremely lazy scholarship, I have to say, where he was trying to say that the Quran teaches neoplatonism. It's essentially the position that Drake holds is he doesn't think hell is eternal. He thinks that when people go down there, they're going to die. They're going to be destroyed after their fiery torment. Right?
Annihilationism.
Annihilationism, exactly. And he thinks that the only way to believe in an eternal conscious torment in hell is with this eternal ghost demon, like ghost doctrine. Basically, your eternal immaterial soul goes down to the underworld and it suffers there forever. And I told him very clearly that yes, the Quran does teach eternal conscious torment, but this ghost Neoplatonic doctrine is not the only way to explain it. God says very clearly, he says, so often as their skins are burnt off, they will be given new skins. So there's going to be a constant burning and regeneration process. But it explains an eternal conscious torment through a physical parameter.
I see. So, man, I had something else to ask real quick. Oh, right. So, would you say then that, I completely lost my train of thought. My bad. Well, you know what? While I think about that, do you have any questions you'd like to ask me on the Bible, my personal beliefs? I'm pretty familiar with Drake's material, so if there's anything that you'd like to know about maybe his beliefs on a certain topic,
Yeah.
go ahead and ask. Yeah.
Well, firstly, I guess a personal question. You're in America, right?
Yeah, I'm diaspora.
How old are you?
I am going to be 27 in November.
27. And what I suppose, because you seem like somebody who studied a lot of worldviews and religions, what has attracted you the most to Christianity and the New Testament, the ethos that you find yourself in today?
Right. So I had not, I'll give you a very brief background of what I did, who I was. So I did not coherently stick to any religion until after I had gone to college. And even the first year, didn't really care about anything, was just trying to enjoy some freedom. The typical, you can probably relate, obviously, you kind of have a very traditional, more controlling family. I had a little bit of freedom and I wanted to taste it. And of course, I gained like 45 pounds and was miserable. But in the second year, I had my own dorm. And it's there that I started to research, not religion at first, but conspiracies. And I never cared about history or politics, but I had kind of like a political, historical awakening. And so my dad and I, he was always a really historic, history-obsessed person, was proud to talk history with me. Anyway, I'll speed up the story a little bit. Through that, I don't remember how, but I eventually found myself going back to the Bible. People were mentioning it on the websites I was looking at, and I started to take it more seriously. I had never really had an atheist phase. I was just kind of like, what's the point of being super religious? I wasn't very religious myself. My family wasn't crazy religious, but they definitely weren't atheists either.
Similar to me a little bit, because even though my mom was quite religious, she would make me sit down and read the Quran. My dad is quite secular, like he couldn't really care less about, the Quran or the Bible or God as much. He would just call himself a Muslim, but he doesn't even do the 5 daily prayers. He just goes to work, comes home, watches TV. So it's kind of similar.
Yeah, so with my dad and his father before him, they were both secular, not in the like, I love being a liberal, but more just like they were just very secular materialists. They believed in, the power of, like the British Empire was idolized in my house for some reason. It seems kind of weird, but yeah.
Yeah, that is strange.
The British Empire was idolized. My grandfather absolutely loved them, idolized them a lot. Because of that, my dad had just a distaste of Roman Catholicism because he read a lot of books on the Protestant Reformation. So he was never really too secular. He just thought that like organized churchism, as he would call it, was deeply flawed. But he's always believed in God, and he read a lot about religious history. He just thought people took it too far. Whereas my mom, she's definitely more spiritual, but not as knowledgeable on theology or anything really. But she would never be an atheist.
Not as academic though, not as scholarly.
Yeah, not as scholarly, and I wouldn't say my dad's that scholarly either. He's read a few books on it, but he's very proud that I've been able to pick this up. Anyway, so I found Christianity again. I kind of just started being a nominal Christian, found my way into Catholicism when I saw the kind of disunity of modern Protestantism. and eventually into Orthodoxy, which is really kind of the natural conclusion if you're looking for traditional apostolic Christianity. It is the Christianity of 381 and onwards for sure, is Orthodoxy.
Yeah, if you hold yourself to that theology, I would say the Orthodox have it right.
Yeah,
And
it's basically
especially with the dissolution of the Catholic Church now with Pope Francis. I mean, I don't know how you could be a traditional Catholic. The mental gymnastics that would require,
well,
you
I would
know.
argue that the theology has been messed up since at least the 1200s. To give you a brief overview, the Catholics have the doctrine of the filioque. Are you aware of, you've
A,
heard
li-
this before?
a little bit, yeah. It means and the Son. Does the Holy Spirit only proceed from the Father, or does he proceed from the Son as well?
Right. So the Catholics, by doing that, completely changed the entire model of the Trinity, in that the Father was no longer the sole originator, because if the Son can be an originator too, then what makes the Father distinct, other than the fact that he's the one who begat the Son? I know it seems like these are all really like minute details, but it changed a
Explain to
lot.
me that. Yeah, explain to me because I've looked a little into the filioque. Tell me what is the significance of this? Where does it lead to, depending on which side of the fence you are with the filioque
Okay.
doctrine? And
So
do Orthodox deny or accept filioque?
completely denied. They think it's
Okay.
blasphemous.
Okay.
So here's the difference. With here, I'll explain from the start.
Yeah.
The very first church fathers, Irenaeus, Justin Martyr, Theophilus, Athenagoras, etc., they all believed in a very limited, simplistic version of monarchia. Monarchia is the polar opposite of the filioque. The monarchia is what the Orthodox follow today. The monarchia states that the Father alone is the originator. From him comes the Son and the Spirit. That's it. But hold it there, because it gets a lot more complex. The ante-Nicene fathers had such a simplistic view of monarchia. I would say the least exaggerated trinity of all the trinities you can believe in today is this one, the ante-Nicene monarchical trinity. And the reason for that is that they basically were admitting that the Father is kind of the only one who's truly God. The Son and the Spirit are really just God by nature of being eternally with the Father. And
Wouldn't
while
that break the Trinity then?
no, and the reason that they said this is that many of the Greek writers would essentially say that because the Father is the originator, he is the one true God that Jesus mentions in John 17:3, which Muslims, Sunnis love to throw at us and go, that disproves the Trinity. But they would say, no, it doesn't, because when we say God, and Dr. Bo Branson will admit this as well, 99% of the time when the scripture talks about it, or when we talk about it, we being Orthodox, we're talking about the person of the Father. The Son is God by the fact that he is eternally with the Father and co-existent with him. So when you read people like Theodore Abu Qura, the first ever church elder to write in Arabic, he would describe God like this. We have God, then his eternal logos, and his spirit, and these three are one. He would not start off saying God is Trinity. He would say, no, God is Father, and with the Father is the Son and the Spirit, who together are one. Now, the distinction is that the Catholics and Protestants, after the Filioque, were saying that God, the word God, means the entire Trinity, whereas the Orthodox, at least the traditional Orthodox, would say, no, no, God is the Father. So they're identifying the word God with the person of the Father. The Catholics were identifying the word God with the absolute divine simplicity, essence, which is shared amongst the three persons. Major difference. It seems like a minute thing, but major, major difference.
It's
And that's
quite an
why,
abstract controversy.
right, but this is why, if you ever watch these Christian Muslim debates, it's always the Orthodox who can elucidate the Trinity in a more concise way, and they have less problems with Jesus calling himself lesser than the Father, because it makes more sense in the paradigm that they're talking about. Whereas with the Catholics, it puts Jesus on a level that he needs to be equal with the Father in pretty much everything. So him having a submissive role seems a little out of place. It also calls into the question how you even explain what the Trinity is. A lot of Orthodox, like Father Thomas Hopko, will say the word triune God is heresy. We don't believe in a triune God. We believe the Father is God and the Son and Spirit are eternally with him. So it is. It probably seems like it's all really abstract stuff, but this is what they were dealing with. Um, but yeah, what else did you want to? Because I still got some time. We can talk about a lot of
Yeah.
other things.
No, no, I like this. I like this. What else was I going to ask you? Um, yeah, I was going to say, I guess, where do you find yourself politically, geopolitically? How do you view the current state of affairs of the world?
Well, I think it's quite obvious to anybody that the world underwent a massive amount of change with not only the Enlightenment and secularization coming to fruition in Western Europe, but specifically it was materialism, and with it kind of atheism, atheistic materialism. And this changed the world in a way never seen before with industrialization. From that point onward, the world is not in the traditional kind of dream that it had been for most of human civilization. So there has been a lot of stress, and the West experienced this first, which is why from the 1800s and onwards, religion has just been completely tanked in the West and regarded more as kind of a side thing that you do within your own heart, rather than this like societal duty to God, which is what you'll find more in the traditional parts of the world. The main issue today is how do we keep the traditional way of life alive? And geopolitically, it's always complicated for a diaspora from some fringe part of the world, fringe by the Western notion, I mean. So you
People
and
like
I,
you and I.
yeah, we're not, stock Americans from New England, obviously, but even then we're not Italian Americans or Irish Americans, but we're also not black or Latino. So we're kind of in this really. You're in Canada, right? By the
Yeah.
way?
Yeah.
Okay, but I'm assuming it's a little similar to the United States. We're
Yeah,
kind of
quite.
this new wave immigrant population, but we're not like people who showed up from the border of Mexico. So
Yeah, we're not like African Americans. They've kind of established their own identity abroad. They're very clearly now distinct from Africans from Africa. People
right.
like you and I, we haven't quite done that yet because not too far back we were back home.
Right, and I would argue that I don't really think there's a necessity for us to have a completely different identity than back home. And so it's strange because I absolutely love America, cherish my life here, I'm very grateful for everything. Simultaneously, I really, really don't want my kids to be diluted and have no culture and not know where they're from. It's one of my greatest nightmares, especially because my soon-to-be wife, well, I haven't proposed her yet, but been with her for a while, my future wife is not from the Middle East at all. And she absolutely appreciates my culture, language, food, everything. She's got no problem with it. But because she's not like an Arabic speaker and I myself am not 100% fluent, I really fear losing this culture along the way. Because
Is
some
she
of
is
my
she
cousins,
European? European?
no, she's actually classic stock American. Her ancestors have been here for like 200 years.
Oh wow. Okay.
So of British descent
Yeah.
primarily, with a little bit of Native American actually. But yeah, so one of my greatest fears is this assimilation into a cultureless life, and it took me a while to realize what was up with America and Canada. And I don't want to be disparaging racially, but there is just something wrong with the white Western population, especially in the New World.
There's something deeply broken and distorted about how people view the world here.
Yes, everything. If you watch any TV show, it's like, what is the purpose of life? I mean, there's some heartwarming stories. A lot of people love their families, but then you ask the deeper question: well, why do you have a family? And what is the purpose of having these children? What culture did you come from? And people will look at you like you're mentally deranged. I'm like a fanatic if I talk about any of these things.
It's
I'm
so
not Adolf Hitler.
superficial. The culture is
Yeah,
so superficial.
right. So that always really, really bugged me, and I've made my girlfriend very aware of these issues, and she finds it. I guess it's my fault, but she finds it kind of harder to relate to her family because they're a lot like that. She says, I don't want our kids to be kind of like just corporate, you know, serfs in America. Like, we got to have some kind of a identity. So geopolitically, I guess I didn't really answer the question of geopolitics, but in terms of inner politics, societal stuff, for me, that's one of the big issues. I mean, the 100%, the reason that America and Canada, well, especially America, have all these racial problems is because these white people don't have a racial identity, and they're sitting around telling themselves that they're white supremacists. I'd like to meet one of these. Because I'm sure they exist, but it's like, this is not a societal problem. You got other societal problems to deal with. And
Yeah.
racial consciousness is the least of your worries.
Yeah.
So it's really strange. I know that Drake is more heavy on the like ethno-nationalism level. What about you? I've heard on their server some of them accuse you of being like too much of a universalist or a humanist person.
Yeah, well, I mean, the way I see it, I just follow what the Quran says, and God makes it clear that He created all the different races in the world so that we can distinguish one another, but that the best of us is those who's most righteous in deeds. And I don't see race mixing as an issue or a problem at all. My wife is already race mixed. She's half Nigerian, half Italian, and if God blesses us with children, our children are going to be half Pakistani, quarter Nigerian, quarter Italian,
I
and
agree with that sentiment.
yeah, I don't see that at all because you know I've never actually found myself attracted to that racialist ideology, and the reason is because let's be honest and real. Who do you prefer being around? Those who think and believe like you, regardless of their skin color, or people of your same skin color who are atheist, secular savages? Who do you really
Exactly.
prefer being around?
Well, obviously the former, those who think alike.
Well, then
And
your whole racial supremacy thing is pretty much precluded. Especially, I mean, Drake. He's it was funny because after my debate with Fight the Flat Earth, he literally publicly called for the I'll be a little PC here for YouTube, but
sure.
he called for the elimination of entire swaths of what he calls whole milk or white people because he was so disgusted at the obfuscation and denial of truth from this British white man that he was seeing. This guy, Fight the Flat Earth, and I'm like, how can you be a racial supremacist at that point? You're the worst racial supremacist I've ever seen because you're calling for the elimination of your whole race on account of their shamefulness.
Right.
Because you're proving
I
what I'm
didn't.
talking about, that you prefer to be around people who believe like you.
I get what you mean. But actually, no, Drake has said before. I was on a voice call with him, and he has said, I would rather hang out with, Arabs and Africans who love God than like random white secularists. Actually, I don't think that's too much of a contradiction. I just don't think he's communicated that as much in some of the videos. But on voice, he's like, yeah, I don't want to hang out with a bunch of like, you know, you know, as he would say, like cucked Westerns. I'd rather hang out with people who love God. That's the primary focus. So I definitely do agree with the sentiment that we have to be with people who are like. Also, in terms of racial purity, I don't know how it is in South Asia, but man, like in the Middle East, I mean, it's really complicated. No one's a pure anything. Even the term Arab is kind of a vague.
It's like a universal term for that whole area. I know.
Yeah, it's universal. Well, it depends on the area. If you say the Arabian Peninsula, they're kind of more like the tribal Arabs, regardless of which nation they're from. They're the ones that you could say, okay, there is the Arab race. Those are the original guys, the ones who actually dress like proper Arabs, and they have more of a traditional tribal lifestyle, and they can pull their ancestors back from like 700 years ago. Okay,
Yeah.
those guys are like the real Arabs, but the average like urban Egyptian, they're kind of just Arabized, but they were already really genetically similar to Arabs. So it's not like, you know, people have this weird idea that like the Arabs came and took over all these races, but really even the ancient Egyptians genetically weren't so different from the people of Arabia. So
But a
it's
lot of the
not.
connection is linguistic, if I'm not mistaken.
Yeah, I
Because
mean,
Arabic was lingua franca, a long time ago.
right, right. But yeah, so I guess in terms of geopolitics, the world's definitely messed with a lot. The mercantile order needs to have some kind of a handle on it because profit cannot be the only thing in the world. We've seen that leads to complete decay, and the idea of racial superiority actually came from Darwinist atheism to begin with. So
Yeah.
it's inherently against the concept of most established religions.
And one thing I want to say regarding the racial supremacy is, if this is a very interesting subject because I think a lot of people who are seeking out tradition and they see the problems with modern Western secularism, they're seeking out some form of traditional morality. They go down hard forms of racism and nationalism, this like Natsoc, neo-Nazi kind of thing, and they think
Trad
it's
based.
yeah,
Yeah.
trad, based and cringe kind of thing, and I see it as a trap. I see it as a trap because let me give you my perspective. If I were to try to, do this whole Pakistani superiority, Punjabi superiority, or Pakhtun superiority, and I'm identifying with this, like, it wouldn't be genuine and honest because I wasn't born and raised there. I'm hardly even half as Pakistani as my parents. I speak Urdu only a little bit, and my Punjabi is even worse than that. I would just be trying to pretend to be somebody I'm not, to live in this kind of glory days that never really existed.
Right.
The fact is this: I'm born and raised in Canada. I'm a Canadian. I'm married to a woman who's ethnically half Nigerian, half Sicilian, and I get because she's from Canada as well. I get along with her. We have more of a similar demeanor than somebody straight from back home in Pakistan. because
Right.
we were born and raised in the same area. A lot of this stuff is cultural. It's not really ethnic. Even if you look at, I've thought about this racial issue so much, and it's like if you look at, let's say, an Indian from the Indian subcontinent, and let's say Indian ethnically people in the Caribbean island, both are the same ethnically. They look similar, but totally different demeanor.
Like
The
from
ethnically,
Guyana
the
as well.
yeah. Yeah, the ethnically Indian in Trinidad, he or she might prefer being with, let's say, a black Trinidadian as opposed to an Indian from the Indian subcontinent, even though they might look more different, them and the black
Sure.
Trinidadian, right? And a lot of this stuff is culture. You're going to get along with people who are similar in culture to you.
Right. I did want to steer the conversation back to a thought I had earlier and I forgot to ask you. So,
Yeah.
Hans, you spoke to him for the first half of your discussion with Drake. He was talking about the nafs and the soul thing.
Yeah.
I let him know that I was going to be speaking with you, and he wanted me to ask basically. I'm probably not going to communicate this properly, but his whole issue with you is he wants to know how on earth you could debunk all the hadith, how you've read all of the hadith, and how you could possibly be more intelligent. Obviously, he doesn't believe in the hadith, but he's still asking how could you be more intelligent than these scholars who have been reading the Arabic for like 45 years and devoted multiple books and their lives to it. How do you know that you've debunked all of the hadith?
Great question. Well, I would return that with a question back to you. How do you and people like Drake know that? How are you able to debunk all of the theology that is developed out of these ecumenical councils, and these scholars that have dedicated their entire life to the Bible, who have read it in the original Greek, who understood the language? How are you able to debunk all of them as well?
Right.
And really, the response is that doesn't matter. It doesn't matter who read or said or did what. It matters who is speaking the truth. And I can demonstrate very clearly, Quranically, how the Quran is to be followed alone. And just wait for my book to come out. There is no place that this hadith has anywhere in the Quran. It contradicts clear statements. And I
What
don't care.
about, sorry to
Yeah.
interrupt, what about there's an often mentioned verse from the Quran that paraphrase goes something like, follow God and obey the Prophet. What does that mean? Because a lot of
Come
them will say, oh, this is the hadith, we have to obey the sunnah.
completely out of context. Read all of these verses within context that talk about obedience to the messenger, and you'll see what's being talking about. Like, for example, the one verse that they'll abuse, they'll say, what is the verse? It says, "Take what the messenger gives you, leave what he doesn't." Oh, you see, this means the hadith. Follow the hadith. No, read the context of that verse. God is saying, with respect to war booty, when the messenger would find himself with war booty, people would bug him for more than their share, more than the portion that they deserve. And then God is basically saying, take what the messenger gives you and leave what he doesn't. Basically, whatever he gives you of the booty, of the charity, take that and don't bug him for any more. This is not talking about any hadith. Again, the question I would pose to you is, show me an explicit passage in the Quran that there would be this other text coming which God would protect and preserve, and this would be a part of our faith. And it doesn't exist anywhere. It doesn't exist
Right.
at all. Why would God leave that out? It's such an important part of our faith. Our faith is incomplete without it. Why would God leave that out? He doesn't mention it once. And
Yeah,
actually,
yeah.
the whole methodology behind your extra text contradicts the Quran's core statements.
What about the polemic that you don't understand the context of some of the Quranic stories without having the hadith? I think one example would be like Abu Lahab. Who is he? What's his whole story if you don't have the hadith? I've heard that one mentioned before.
Curse the father of flame. Yeah, my understanding of that is that the father of flame is just an archetype for a wicked man whose wife supports him as well in wickedness. It's just an archetype that God is giving us.
I
And
see.
even still, again, I have to return the question back to you people. Let's say, and this is something I talk about in my book, which I'm writing. Let's say you bring up a question to me that I don't know the answer to, and I'll just say, hey, I don't know. Does that mean the hadith is justified to bring in all this trolley of stuff that the Quran never talks about? No. I believe the Quran is complete and clear and perfect. Even if I don't have the answer for every single question, I do believe the Quran has it somewhere. It's just I am not privy to it yet. That's the fundamental difference between me and the Hadith. And I believe the Quran is complete, and he doesn't. He feels the unnecessary, desire to drag in all this extra stuff to explain whatever's missing from the Quran, whatever he thinks. That's the difference between him and I. So
Okay.
it's not a matter of me being able to answer every question, although I'll try my best. It's that I fundamentally believe the Quran is complete. Even if the answer, I don't know it yet, I believe it's somewhere within the Holy Quran.
Okay. Well, one other thing. Well, actually, unless you have to go anytime soon, I think we
No,
can
I'm
keep talking.
Let's keep going.
Okay, so let's get back to kind of Bible now, if you don't mind. So, in your last debate with the Southern Israelite and Hans, there was some mention of differentiation in the Gospels. I actually looked into this issue of the different account of the crucifixion, and it actually appears that in the first account, where Jesus says, my God, why have you forsaken me?" And then he gives out this cry. One of the lines is, "And then he cried out," or he let out a cry, and then he dies. Whereas in, I think it's Luke, the account is, he says, "It is finished," which is obviously not the same as, my God, why have you forsaken me?" But the difference is that
I think
this,
John, he says it is finished. I think Luke, he says, "Father, into thy hand I commend my spirit."
right, but the spirit of Luke and John is very similar in that he has kind of a more accepting answer to this crucifixion,
Yeah.
right? Whereas in the other accounts, it's more this kind of terror of what's occurring on the cross, or letting out this wrath. And actually, the explanation is that in those earlier accounts, where he has this, my God, why have you forsaken me?" That's before he lets out a cry. But in the later accounts, he lets out the cry first, and then he says his line. So the explanation would be he said both, but the cry is what interrupts it. And one of the gospel writers is only mentioning the first part of his statement, the other is mentioning the latter half. I don't think they mentioned that when they were talking to you, but this is the main view of most of the biblical scholars, that he actually did say both, but each gospel writer is only putting in a piece of the puzzle, since they're meant to be read together. Like how the three synoptic, as they're called, gospels don't talk about deep theology that much, but Jesus hints at who he is. Sorry, there's a dog somewhere in the lobby nearby my office. But so if you hear that, just please ignore it. But
That's fine.
the Gospel of John is the one that actually talks more about the depth of theology, like where did Jesus come from, and so on and so forth. So I guess what I wanted to state is, earlier we talked about why you had chosen the Quran only position, but what are some other elements of Christianity? Let's stick with the New Testament. Forget the Old Testament for now. What are some elements of the gospel narrative or the writings of Paul? You don't have to give a specific line for line reading or anything. What are some elements of theology that you find to be unacceptable or incoherent in the grand scheme of things in your theology?
Yeah, well, I would start with the Trinity doctrine. This idea that there's these three co-equal, co-eternal persons, and all of them are God. I think this fails both logically and scripturally. If I had to believe the Bible and New Testament, if that was my only option, I would probably adopt something similar to Drake, an Arian or semi-Arian position. I think that is more or less like the most consistent position you can hold with the New Testament. So that would be another one of my problems, the Trinity. The Trinity is a big problem.
Okay, now let's say you do accept or you accept that Drake's position is the only one possible for the New Testament. Within his theology, what are some issues of, let's say, like the crucifixion, the atonement, anything like that? Are those also problematic for you?
Yeah, the problem is one moment. I think I'm trying to. Okay, there we go. Yeah. So my main issue is this whole concept of God having this Son that's existed, before the creation of the world, and He came and He's going to die on the cross for our sins. This seems like a complete departure from what is taught within the Old Testament. I just think, and yeah, Christians they show passages in the Old Testament saying, oh, here's the angel of the Lord being worshipped, and this is Jesus actually, and here's the thing. I see Christians as working backwards. They start with their premise and they work backwards and try to find it within the Old Testament. Is there any explicit passage within the Old Testament that says this, that God has this Son and He's a very important part of our salvation process? This doesn't exist anywhere, and I don't think God would leave us in the dark about such a fundamental issue of doctrine. This only
Actually,
comes later on.
if I can say, I believe this is, let me see if this is the Masoretic or the Septuagint, but there is one example of there being explicitly a son rather than just the angel of the Lord, which is Proverbs 30, verse 4, and it reads, "Who is ascended into heaven or descended? Who has gathered the wind in his fists? Who has bound the waters in a garment? Who has established all the ends of the earth?" And then the line says, "What is his name and what is his son's name, if you know?" And it's a proverb, so it's kind of a book of wisdom. So it's not about, it doesn't explicitly say who this son is. You're correct about that, but
Yeah.
it does seem to mention that there is this kind of son of God. Now, the
And the Son
thing
is
that
used throughout the Old Testament. We have Benoi Elohim, the sons of God, knew the
sure.
daughters of men. But what I mean is like an explicit passage showing the Christian doctrine. This idea that this man is going to come, this man, son of God, he's going to die on the cross for our sins, his blood is going to be shed for us, and he's going to raise again in 3 days. And this is a very important, integral part of our salvation process. This is missing because all the prophets, as far as I know of the Old Testament, they just worshiped God alone. They didn't have any concept of Jesus because Jesus, at least in his human incarnation in the Christian worldview, didn't exist at the time.
Right. Well, a
There seems
lot
to
of
be there was a turn that happened, like a 180-degree turn that happened with the New Testament, where there's a new component to our religion, a significantly new component.
I see. Well, most people, obviously, from the Christian perspective, I would argue that oh, hang on a second, on my computer cord, would argue that there is an element of progressive revelation, but that most Christians who argue that take it way too far, in that they take it to an extreme. But that doesn't mean that, from day one, everyone had the immediate theology. Like Abraham, for example, he doesn't know the law of Moses, but he does know circumcision. Noah doesn't know the law of Moses, but he does know clean from unclean animal. Moses knows the entire law because he's given the entire law, and he makes a very vague reference to one who is coming, which is interpreted as the Messiah by Jews and Christians. Then the Messiah figure is developed more in time throughout the time of David and into the Babylonian captivity. So there is the concept that revelation can progress. You don't have to have all of the knowledge on day one because the Bible is written in a very linear chronological way, which is unlike in how in the Quran it kind of starts with, it kind of jumps all over the place chronologically. I don't mean that in a disparaging way, but that it tells the story of various events, not in any particular
It focuses
order.
more on philosophical meaning as opposed to chronology.
Right. So because the Bible is like a chronological book made up of history and theology, there's a lot of portions of it where there's some theology that occurs later that people weren't as aware of. Like in Daniel chapter 7, Daniel has a vision in heaven of there being the Ancient of Days, who is God himself. And then there's a Son of Man who's like this divine figure who's going up to the throne and wielding all this power and sitting with God. And so that's where you have this kind of duality starting to form. So it does form in the Old Testament, even if it's not there in day one. Obviously, most Christians interpret the angel of the Lord to be Christ himself in kind of a pre-incarnate form. Drake says, no, it's not, but I don't know if I agree 100% with his argumentation for that. The angel of the Lord seems to have a very interesting role. Are you familiar with some of the common Christian apologetics regarding the angel of the Lord, like why he has such a strange role, how he's not like other angels?
Not so much, actually. You can fill
Okay.
me in on that one.
Yeah, I'll give you some examples. So in Genesis chapter 16, Hagar, the second wife of Abraham, or the concubine of Abraham, she is despaired and she's with Ishmael, and the angel of the Lord comes to her, and they have a conversation. At the end of this conversation, she says, are you the one who sees me? Or the text reads, she said to Jehovah, meaning the divine name, you are the God who sees me. And so upon glance, that would seem a little inappropriate to call the one in front of her Jehovah when that's supposed to be God's name, and then B, say, you are the Elohim who's looking at me. And another example would be in like Judges 13, angel of the Lord is visiting Manoah, and Manoah realizes it's the angel of the Lord, which is what the text says. It says Manoah knew it was the angel of the Lord, but then the next words out of his mouth are, we're going to die because we've seen God. So why doesn't he just say we've seen this messenger? So these are some of the verses that seem to imply that this angel of the Lord either is able to, in Drake's perspective, represent God and thus bear his name, but the Trinitarian perspective would be this is like the multiplicity of God being displayed in the Old Testament. So there is a lot of precedence for these arguments. The angel of the Lord does have a position that I know in the Islamic theology would be considered a little inappropriate for a created angel to be given this much reverence. Am I
Yeah,
correct?
Quranically, I would have to discard that verse of the Old Testament. Yeah.
Okay. So there's a few more. I'm not going to name all of them, but essentially, like in another one, Zechariah chapter 3, the angel of the Lord Zechariah is having a vision. The angel of the Lord is up in heaven with Joshua, and Shaitan is there too. And the angel of the Lord sees that Joshua is covered in these filthy robes. Symbolically, that's his sin. And the angel of the Lord walks up to him and rips it off and says, see, I've removed your sin from you, which is supposed to only be God's objective, or sorry, God's responsibility is to remove sin. So there is a lot in this kind of what you could say is like a high angelology in the Old Testament, and that the angelic beings have a much different place and authority than angels would have according to the Quran. Am I correct in stating that?
Yes, definitely.
Right. So these are some points of contention where there is kind of a it's interesting because the rabbis and rabbinic Judaism, they really have a very poor explanation for these kind of verses. Another example would be verses where God explicitly enters creation in the Old Testament, and the rabbinics say no, he does not, but the verse just says he does, like in Exodus chapter 17, verse 5 and 6, when God tells Moses, go strike the rock at Horeb. You know the story, right? And the water comes out.
Yeah.
Right. So he says, I will stand next to you when you do that. I don't know, the rabbinic commentary flops all over the place, but the verse says, I will stand next to you. And in Deuteronomy 34, when Moses dies, it says God went and buried Moses so that no one would know where he's buried. And so I have an issue with the way the rabbinics are looking at this text, and they themselves are doing what you said a lot of the Trinitarians would do. They're reading this, well, God can enter creation, therefore, and kind of putting that into the verse where the verse is saying, no, God just appeared to show up, like right in front of Moses. And it just matter-of-factly says, and God showed up. It doesn't even explain how or why, or like, there's no metaphysics. He just kind of shows up. So
Yeah, well, the Bible's not a book on theology or anything like that. It just tells us these narratives, and the same thing with the Quran. It's not this massive book on theology. It tells us these narratives, and we try to understand and explain it as best as possible.
yeah, one of the issues that I agree with Drake on is this stimulating of theology. You know, the books that God has given us seem to be, you know,
It wasn't
like
meant for that. It's meant to be practically applied wisdom in your day-to-day life.
right, and
It's
that's
not supposed to
why.
be this, kind of, and I hate to use the term, but it's such a good term, but this like mental masturbation over theology.
I know what you.
It's
Yeah.
not meant for that.
Right, and that's why sometimes when atheists are going all over the place attacking whether it's the Quran or the Bible, they have to step back and think, well, let's presuppose a couple things. If there is a God, there's going to be one God, because science has already proven that things, are in unity. They come from one source, not five different gods. We can talk about that another time. We're going to say there's only one God. It kind of discards all the weird Eastern religions. Now we're stuck with the Abrahamic religions. Of those, don't you think God would give them a scripture? Yes. Of that scripture, don't you think he would want people to follow it? Yes. Okay. Of them following it, don't you think the average person should be able to understand what's happening? Yes. Okay. Then why would the books be super complicated? And there's your answer. Like, I know it seems very simple, but really, why
It's
would God
true.
send a book that's
He he, he
insanely
he would send a book down which is palatable and digestible to the common person if he expects the common person to follow its dictates.
What do you think of? I think it was. Correct me if I have the historical names incorrectly. It was Al-Maimun who had opposed the idea of an eternal, uncreated Quran, and the followers of Ahmad bin Hanbal were saying, no, the Quran is uncreated. First of all, what's your position on that? Is it uncreated, or did God create it? The Quran.
Obviously, God created the Quran. I don't know where this idea comes from that it's uncreated.
The Sunnis say that. They say it existed before time. There was never a time where the Quran was not. It almost
Yeah,
sounds like Aryan.
yeah,
Arius.
I've heard it from them. This almost sounds a little metaphysical in nature as well. This like eternal, uncreated Quran coexisting with God doesn't make any sense. The
And
Quran
these
is
are the
it's
guys who are attacking the Trinity, right?
Yeah, exactly. You almost have like a duality right there. These
Right.
two uncreated entities, the Quran and God, in working in synchronicity. It's strange because the Quran it's just a spoken word of God. The Quran existed when God spoke these words and decided for man to record them and to hear them. It's
Right.
just it's just a text of God telling us what to do and how to live our life and with great wisdom. That's it.
I've learned that in my studies of theology, I've gone kind of backwards on this. Sometimes the inference to the simplest explanation is the best. Not always, but a lot of times the answer is right in front of you, and the like we said, mental masturbation is going to get you nowhere.
Oh,
Sometimes the
big
answer is
time.
right there, and it's like, how did God do this? Like for the Quran, right? God gave us the Quran. Okay, is it a book? Yes. Do we read it? Yes. Did God speak it? Yes.
It's
All right,
like
so
it's
so
like
I'm gonna assume
asking.
it's a book, not some eternal transcendental thing that's one with his essence or whatever, however they say it.
Yeah, it's okay. It's like asking me, okay, Willie, did you write the Flat Earth Manifesto? Yes. Did the Flat Earth Manifesto exist with you since the beginning when you were born, coexisting with your mind? Like, why are you asking this question?
Well, I'll give you
It's a book that I've written.
I'll tell you
It's
why they do that. Because they come to these strange conclusions, because they overly mentally masturbate. So they go, well, God is eternal, right? So his words, because he's transcendental, his words have to eternally be with him. Therefore, the Quran has to be eternal. Something ridiculous like that. They kind of put themselves in these boxes with their own like philosophy. It's really strange.
I call it in my book, The Flat Earth Manifesto. I talk about it. I call these people who they study theology and philosophy all day, and they get into all these nitty gritty issues that don't really have any bearing on our life, and they don't actually live like a godly, righteous person, fighting in God's cause, struggling in God's cause. I call these people castrated intellectuals.
That's funny.
Castrated intellectuals. The castrated part is because they seem to lack the genuine masculine urge to do things in the cause of God, to get married, to go meet people, to congregate with people like them, to spread the truth, and instead they just want to mentally masturbate about theology. So that's the intellectual part. Like high IQ, but not really much masculine urge.
Yeah, it's interesting. The internet has yielded a lot of that, and that's why it's dangerous for so many young people to hop onto this theology train. Some of them end up mentally broken, where they've listened to so many competing things they can't form a coherent theology anymore. So it's quite dangerous. People like you and Drake, lesser people would become mentally broken by kind of going, I'm not going to listen to the Hadith, or I'm done with the church fathers. Well, lesser people, and there are many examples on YouTube of people who try to do their own thing and they end up turning into like a nutcase.
Yeah, and here's the thing. Even within the Bible and the Quran, there are more mysterious and ambiguous passages. Did God put these excuse me, did God put in these passages for us to endlessly debate and harp over them? Or are we supposed to just focus on the foundations of it? So, the moral law, how we are to live our life, what the foundations of our doctrine are, and go and spread that to the people and be living examples of what a righteous man is? What is the purpose of our lives, really?
Right.
Like, for example, there's a verse in the Quran, the number 19, and there's a whole cult of people who go really, really hard on this number 19. They think this number 19 is the key to the Quran, it's a code to the Quran, because there's this verse where God says, and the companions of the fire, he made them only as angels, and there are 19 above it. The verse goes something like that. And they have this whole numerological theology which they create just off of that one verse. And the way I see it is, are we supposed to be worrying so much about this number 19, which is debatable, what it really means, what God is saying? Or are we supposed to just harness the foundation, the essence of the law, and do good deeds in our life? Be
Right.
men.
Right. Yeah, there is definitely a distinction between what God is commanding and then what people do on behalf of Him in an intellectual way. Like, for example, a great argument I heard from some of the guys I speak to on Discord of the platform, they'll say it was either Drake or Hans who said this, and they pretty much said all of these intellectual theologians think that with all the stuff they've invented a religion unrecognizable to what God was intending to give. Therefore, they think that they're smarter than the God of the Hebrews and his shepherd
Big time.
prophets.
Big time.
Because who are the prophets? Are they Greek intellectuals, or is Moses just like the adopted son of Pharaoh who turns into a shepherd?
Here's a great question. Would Moses and Abraham and Muhammad, would they even understand the theology that has been developed today? I reckon probably not.
Well, if you could bring them back in that state, yeah, but okay, I agree with you, but obviously, theoretically, God could just give them all this knowledge
That
since
is
they're
true.
such exalted figures. But I get what you're saying, yeah. If we went back in time to Moses and we said, hey, listen up, we're going to give you some of this outstanding theology from these fathers, or like Al-Ghazali, I don't think he would even contemplate what it is. And he would probably, to be honest, people don't want to hear this, but Moses would probably just stone people who were getting too crazy and adding things onto God's law. I mean, it's quite simple. You're supposed to just follow God and be a practical person, and God chose the people of the Middle East to be his prophets for a reason, not because they were the great intellectual philosophers of the world. And there's a reason for that.
If I went to Moses and asked him, "Hey Moses, is there a distinction between God's essence and his attributes and his activities, or are they all one and the same? But if they're separate, wouldn't that mean a distinction in the one God? Wouldn't that mean there's multiple gods?" I have a strong feeling that he would not engage in that debate.
Probably, yeah, there's a good chance you'd probably be punished for trying to like lead people astray. I'm not even
Yeah,
trying to make it a joke. I
they
mean,
might think I'm a sorcerer or something like that.
right, because this is the kind of like if you read these stories, these are on purposely, these are not crazily complicated stories. When God comes down to Moses in Exodus 33, and Moses says, "Show me your glory," and God says, "You cannot, because no man can see my face and live, but I'll pass by you if you hide behind that rock and you can see my back." And then people go on these endless debates. Well, the back could be the energies. Hang on a minute. Hang on a minute. All right. All he said is he's going to walk past Moses. You don't have to know what that means. It could be a form of fire. It could be a form of anything else. You don't have to know what it means. Like, I don't need to know what God looks like. The Bible specifically says don't depict God. So I don't need to know what his innate natural form is or how he walked past. Like, did he move his knees or are his knees real? It's just, why are we even talking about these subjects?
Did Adam have a belly button debate? Like that, these
So
kinds of questions.
is it relevant? Is the better question.
Yeah, that's the
How's
thing.
that going to make you a better person?
Yeah, what was God doing before he created the world? I don't know. It's not for me to contemplate this. It's a waste of time.
It is a waste of time. And then you'll hear, well, wait, did God create time? It's like just, well, why don't you create some time and go do something productive? Ridiculous.
Exactly. You have perhaps too much created time on your hands.
Yeah, yeah, that's another thing. People do have too much time on their hands in general nowadays. That's why there's so. I look. You can talk about ideology and philosophy, but one of the reasons this you know what epidemic with the Skittles and so on is so ridiculous today.
Oh yeah, the LTGB, whatever they call
The
themselves.
BBQs, yeah.
Yeah.
The problem with them is they got their life's too easy and they have nothing. They have no struggle and nothing to do. Too much time on their hands, and a lot of them come from broken homes. You put all that
Yeah.
together, what
And
do
a
you think
lot
you're
of
gonna
let's
get?
throw in a lot of pornography as well, which warps their mind even further.
Yeah, you put these together, what are you gonna get?
You're gonna get delusion. Even my wife, she was actually showing me yesterday, and basically a video of a person. She's like, this person identifies as transracial. So I think it was like a white person pretending to be Korean.
That's hilarious.
And obviously, my wife was appalled and disgusted by it. And I just told her, I'm like, babe, why not? Why not? If we can say that we are not the gender that our physical body tells us, why can we not say that we're not the race that our physical body shows us to
Exactly.
be? Where does it
Exactly.
stop? Now, why can't we go even further than that and not identify as our age? Why can't a 56-year-old guy end up saying, hey, I'm actually, I don't like the adult world. I don't like the responsibilities that come with it. I'm actually a 7-year-old child and I want to check into the nearest daycare and I want people to feed me and put me in a crib.
There are actually, you joke, but there are actually men who've done similar things beyond.
Yeah,
But yeah, this all comes from this idea, this warped idea, and this, maybe some people take it too far, but I would posit that a lot of it comes from this idea that you can use a soul as an excuse. And so many people, their argument, especially the trans, would say something like,
I'm a girl
well,
on the inside. What,
right,
what, what inside are you talking about? Are you talking about some ghost, some female ghost inside of you?
yeah,
That's
and these are the people who say that there is no God. Why are you believing in souls? I mean, this just doesn't make sense. I'm not saying God teaches a soul, but I'm saying the concept is explicitly like some kind of theist or deistic belief. You can't possibly. It's so weird to see Western authority figures go like, yeah, we got to believe in the science. We don't need no church. And then 10
yeah.
seconds later, all men are created equal because of our souls. Because
They
of our what?
pretend. Yeah, it's interesting because they pretend like, especially these atheistic LTBG type people, they pretend like they're materialist, rationalist, just only interested in the science, but their belief is laden with nothing but metaphysics and theology.
Exactly. Well, actually, if they were true inheritors of Darwin, then they should have no problem with these kind of racial supremacist types. That's where it came from. So if they're going to
Yeah,
say, I'm an atheist materialist like Darwin, then why are you against these like national socialist freaks? They're only doing, like, you do realize
they're
all this
continuing the
racial,
tradition of Darwin.
yeah, all this racial consciousness and ethno-nationalism came after religion was removed from Europe, not because of religion. So they're
Yeah,
not even attacking the right horse here.
yeah. there's plenty of inconsistencies. I brought this up in my debate. This guy's an atheist with Fight the Flat Earth, Craig, Fight the Flat Earth. I brought it up with him. I'm just like,
I've seen it
you,
before.
yeah, you want to talk about that goofball. You want to talk about science and materialism. Well, what about this transgender stuff that you stand for? Is there anything scientific? Is there anything rational and physical and objective and measurable that shows you that a man can be a woman and a woman can be a man? Is there anything that justifies this doctrine of gender identity? And he's basically just like, yeah, you know what? I don't want to go down that road.
Of course he doesn't.
We're allies here. We respect, and Waleed, if you respect me, you're not going to go down this road. Basically, avoiding the issue, which is going to show the contradiction in his worldview.
Well, funnily enough, he could go to Tehran and find people who agree with him, because in Iran they believe
It's very secular there, I think, right?
It's not just the secularism. The Shia religion says that it is better that if a man has homosexual feelings, they kind of force him to be transgender, and they just say he had a female soul. It's better for him to be a straight woman than to be a gay man. It's ridiculous. They only do it in Iran.
I've never heard of that in my life. That
Look it
blows
up.
me. I've never, and Pakistan has a bunch of problems with these strange practices that have crept into their Islam, but I've never even heard of that in Pakistan.
Well, it's mainly a Shia thing, and I do have to make a distinction. Arab Shia don't do it. It's mainly an Iranian thing where, like I said, because of their idea of a soul, they say, oh, that guy's homosexual. Well, he must have a female soul. Instead of killing him, let's just kind of force him to be a woman, and therefore we'll have
Let's
a bunch of
let's
men and
complete
women.
the process.
Right, whereas in Saudi Arabia, obviously, it would just be like, it's over. Get rid of that guy.
That's how
By
it
the
would be
way,
in
speaking
Pakistan
of,
too.
my friend Hans, he's from a very traditional region in the Arab world. Well, it's all very traditional, but even more so for him. He's from a more tribal area, and he has accused you of being too much a liberal and that you're against the Sharia law. What do you say to that? Are you a liberal?
No, I'm not. I simply follow the Quran and what it says. And whenever the Quran happens to line up with liberalism, I guess if you want to call me liberal, okay. Wherever
Not
the Quran.
liberalism. He thinks that you're going against like the punishments of the Sharia law specifically, that you
Well,
don't agree with them.
the punishments of the Sharia law, they're not based in the Quran, so many of them are unjust. For example, this idea that it's in the Sharia law, we are to, if I'm not mistaken, we have to take a homosexual and throw them off a high place, a building, right?
Right, I've heard that one.
Yeah, that's not in the Quran. The Quranic punishment for sexual misconduct is lashes. I'm just interested in what the Quran follows, man, and whether that puts me in line with something a liberal says here, or a conservative says there, or Sharia says here. It doesn't really matter.
I see what you mean.
I'm just interested in what the Most High says.
What do you think of people who are slightly liberalized, because he doesn't have the excuse you do that you have the Quran only? So Shabir Ali, he accepts the Hadith, but with that, he still says we can't do the hand cutting or the apostasy because, we're in the 21st century, something like that. And it's weird that he dresses so conservatively. I believe he's of South Asian descent, but from the Caribbean.
He's Guyanese, yeah. I think he's
Yeah.
Guyanese, but he looks obviously like a Dravidian to me, like a South Indian.
He dresses like he's from like the most conservative part of like Bangladesh or Pakistan, but he isn't that conservative. What do you think of people like that? What's his deal?
I would just say he has a lot of mental gymnastics to contend with, because the main problem here is the Hadith, because even Shabir Ali, this foremost scholar, he recognizes that even in the Sahih collection, Sahih Bukhari, Sahih Muslim, this stuff is still not perfect. And my question is, then if the very Hadith sifting process, which Imam Bukhari and Imam Muslim went through, if that was not good enough, if you still have doubtful narrations in your Sahih collections, then how do you determine what is right and wrong? All you're left with is just this arbitrary pick and choose game. I'm going to pick this Hadith because I like it. I'm going to throw out this one because I don't like it. Either you accept the entire Sahih corpus in its entirety and you say, hey, all this stuff is right, and you go consistent with that, or you reject it all. Otherwise, you have no standard. You're just picking and choosing what you like, and that's kind of what Shabir Ali does.
Yeah, Shabir Ali is an interesting one. For some reason, he has an absurd amount of fame on the internet, like in the Christian versus Muslim. He's kind of like the champion of He's kind of like the champion of like the Muslim debater. But
yeah,
then
he's very well spoken and approachable. I can see why people like him.
Right, but at the same time, he seems to be someone that does not actually align with what most non-diaspora Muslims actually believe. Like he
He's a little
seems to
more
be like
liberalized.
the diaspora guy.
Yeah, a little. He's a little more liberalized. I guess he gives a rendition of Sunni Islam that's a little more palatable to the Westerner.
It's strange. I think Yasser Qadhi does the same thing. But then you have guys like Muhammad Hijab who are trying to like, and he's not like an amazing theologian. I'm sure you know who he is, but
Yeah,
he's like
I've
trying to
made
be.
videos on him.
I believe he's more philosophically trained. He's almost like a Sunni Jay Dyer,
I
if
think
I'm
he
not
has.
mistaken.
Yeah, pretty much. He has a fairly impressive academic resume.
What do you think of? I don't know his last name to be honest. But what do you think of Farid Responds? You know his channel?
Farid, maybe. Let me type him up quickly and see if I recognize him.
Salafi from Bahrain. He doesn't do a ton of YouTube anymore, but
Farid, what's his last name?
he doesn't have a. I don't know his last name, but his channel is just Farid Responds. He has 62,000 subscribers.
Farid responds. Oh, I've actually not really seen much of his content.
I would recommend you look at some of him. Obviously, he believes in Hadith, but maybe you could do a little documentaire on him because he's one of the. I'm not Muslim, obviously, but he's one of the more intelligible Muslims on the internet who doesn't do like political gerrymandering like Muhammad Hijab does. He actually just tries to do the scripture and the Hadith, and that's kind of it.
Yeah, not this kind of clickbait content. Reacting to two LTBG Muslims, just picking on all this low hanging fruit. These silly
No,
videos. Yeah.
like if you click his channel, his playlists are who authored the gospel with ijaz from the EF Dawah, proofs of prophethood, Islamic history, defense of the Quran, and then a lot of them are responses to like these kind of really clickbaity Christians like David Wood. So, oh, is David Wood correct about Muhammad? Well, obviously he's going to say no. So he'll do videos on that. But I actually, when I was kind of inquiring into Islam a while ago, he was one of the guys I watched because he just seems like a humble, educated person, and he's not one of these clickbaity like I'm here to destroy the Christians, or I'm going to respond to, like you said, some liberal football player has a rainbow soccer ball. It's nothing like that.
Yeah, it's more thoughtful.
Yeah, so maybe you could see what he's up to. You'd obviously get the background more than me.
Lord willing.
Before we close out, I do want to get back just to the Bible and the Quran one more time. So
Yeah.
I guess what I want to say is, what do I want to say? Well, you discussed a couple of the reasons why you didn't accept Christianity or anything related to Christianity, like Drake's platform would obviously be related to Christianity.
Yeah.
What do you think of the inverse? What do you think of maybe not Drake's critiques in particular, but other people's critiques of Islam? So, for example, there's a couple verses in the New Testament that many Christians would wager is a direct kind of prophetic mention of trying to rebuke anybody like Muhammad from making a prophecy. I think it's in Galatians where Paul writes, if anyone, whether they hear it from God or an angel, proclaims a different gospel, don't listen to them. And then there's one more from Corinthians where Paul says, behold, Shaitan can make himself like an angel of light. So a lot of Christians will say, oh, that means that the angel that Muhammad saw in the cave, Jibril, we can't trust it. It must be Shaitan. What would you say to those kind of arguments, first of all?
I would just say to them, analyze and see how consistent really is Paul with the doctrine within the Old Testament. We have two people claiming to be kind of the seals of the prophet. We have Paul here, right, who's saying that nobody else can come preaching a new gospel, and we have Muhammad as well in the Quran claiming, and just see who is really more consistent with the uncompromised monotheism within the Old Testament. Who teaches a religion which is more similar to that, and
Right,
then you choose which prophet to follow from there.
I suppose so, but most of the times the response that I would give in this kind of scenario would be that rather than looking at the Tanakh alone, we would say Paul is more intimately aware with what Jesus teaches in the gospel. Therefore, if we're going to believe in Jesus, Paul is more aware of Jesus than Muhammad, more trustworthy since he's in his lifetime. And because the other disciples accept him, such as Peter, they have met Paul and they didn't say that this guy was a psycho. So there are a lot of Christians like Ebionites are kind of a weird heretical group, and they deny Paul, but they keep the rest of the New Testament. Obviously, I don't believe anything like that. But we would just say, well, Paul is closer to Christ, and if I believe in Christ, I'm going to believe in Paul as well. Also, Drake makes the point that, unlike what the Ebionites and a lot of Muslims claim, Paul does not do away with the Torah law. And in fact, he's just teaching kind of a moderated form of it without going crazy into the tradition of men that the rabbinics had been doing. So, for example, like are you aware of the Acts 15 Council of Jerusalem?
A little bit, yeah.
Right. So it's basically a council between James and Paul. They bring Paul in because he's been accused of some things and they want to clarify the law. And so they agree at the end because they're saying, well, we need to go circumcise all the Gentiles. And Paul says, well, let's not, I'm just paraphrasing. Let's not do that. Let's just have them abstain from blood and food offered to idols, sexual immorality, and false gods and stuff like that. Just bare basics. And most people would interpret that as saying, oh, you know what? Paul just completely does not agree with the law, therefore we're free from the law. But in reality, what Paul is saying, he says, for Moses is read aloud in every synagogue on Sabbath. The implication is that whoever these pagans are, whether they're Greeks or Arabs or Romans, once they convert, even though we're going to be light on them in the beginning, the implication is that they're going to be going to synagogue every Sabbath, listening to Moses, and that's how they'll learn the law. We're not going to throw all 613 laws at them on day one. So that's kind of like how I mentioned earlier with Mark 7 and the vision of Peter, that there's a distinction between what the book's trying to say and then what kind of people have presupposed with like, oh, you know, the food is clean or the law is broken. So I guess what I wanted to say is that, you know, the Paul of like the modern audience or the historic Paul may not be the Paul that's actually in the text itself.
What I would say with respect to Paul is simply, let me see, I have a few notes that I've written on him.
Sure. And just so you know, like whoever else will be watching this, I should have said this at the beginning. Waleed and I are not doing like a formal time debate. We're just having a discussion. There's obviously going to be parts that we disagree with each other on, and so we're discussing them because it's interesting. This is not like, you know, a time debate between Shamoun and Shabir Ali or anything.
No, nothing like that.
No.
Let me see. Here's the thing with Paul. My issue is, and I get it, and I understand why Drake and perhaps people like you and others, they give it that interpretation that Paul, you know, he was not teaching for us to not keep the law, but he was just kind of moderating it a little bit because the Pharisees went too far by inventing their own man-made laws. And I don't see that when I read Paul. When I read Romans, whether he intended it or not, God knows best. I think the logical conclusion of any rational reading of his writings that I don't have to keep any of the law of God in order to be justified before the Most High because Jesus died for my sins. I think he does teach that faith alone doctrine.
Well, do you know, well, I wouldn't disagree with you, but do you know Drake's analysis of that entire chapter and the rest of Paul's writings? He basically says, okay, we agree with that. Paul is saying that because the law is not supposed to be an instrument of eternal salvation. Like in the Torah, where it's taught through Moses, the condition is if you follow this law and behave, you'll be allowed to live in the Holy Land of Canaan, not eternal salvation. So Drake is arguing that, yeah, you don't need the law for eternal salvation. Anyone who's teaching that, Paul is going to attack them. But the law is there for governance and discipline and society on earth. But your salvation is still coming from Jesus. So that would be how he would answer that. I mean, I've read all of his material, most of his material on Paul, so I'm intimately aware of how he justifies keeping Paul in this more law-based theology.
I would respond to that by saying, with Paul, what was the last thing you just said? Could you refresh my memory?
Sure. So basically, Drake makes a distinction between the covenant of grace, which is your eternal salvation before God, and then a covenant of Sinai, which was this kind of conditional pact that if you obey the law, you'll go to the Holy Land. Therefore, keeping the law is about keeping order on earth, not eternal salvation. So there's two different covenants going on at the same time.
Okay, since you would be more familiar with Drake's soteriology than me, I would ask, or maybe give me your soteriology or Drake's,
Sure.
or if you agree with him or whatever. But part of the law of God, you know, part of the Levitical law was also not to murder, right? Not
Right.
to be dishonest in my business dealings. And this is one of, I guess this segues me nicely into another criticism of Christianity I have, and that is, if, you know, if the law is not really responsible for my salvation, does that mean I can be a murderer, a wicked man, a scam artist, a sexual deviant, a pervert? I can be just the most sinful, wicked man possible. But if I truly, truly believe that Jesus Christ, the Son of God, who died on the cross for my sins and rose again in 3 days, and that his blood washes my sins, will I be saved before God on Judgment Day?
I would say no, and the reason, well, I'll first say only God would know. But
Yeah,
from my limited form of knowledge,
yeah.
what I would say is based on the text, the law is it's not meant to be an option. You still have to follow it, but it's not to do with your eternal salvation. Now you said, well, what if I murder, but I still have the eternal salvation of Christ? Well, accepting Christ does not automatically mean once saved, always saved, which is what a lot of American Protestants believe. They believe once saved, always saved. There's nothing you can do to stop yourself from going to heaven. That's it. You've got the gift.
That's Steven
Whereas,
Anderson.
yeah, whereas our soteriology would be no, not at all. The gift is there. You can take it, but you can be thrown off of that list if you keep a horrific life. The only thing that Jesus is offering is the option or the ability to become saved if you believe in this and you live a holy life. But that doesn't mean that automatically accepting it means, bam, that's it, everybody gets salvation. Only that the only way to get salvation is, sorry, the only way to get salvation is through Jesus. That doesn't mean that once you believe in Jesus, you automatically get the salvation for free. It's just he is the only way to go through. This is mirrored in the Old Testament. Moses gives the law, and he's the perfect law keeper, but he disobeys God in one aspect, and God decides not to allow him to enter the Holy Land, so he dies before then. So it is not Moses, the lawbringer, who brings the Israelites into the Holy Land, but it's Joshua, and Yeshua are basically the same name. So the theme there is that the law of Moses must be followed, but it'll get you like 90% of the way. You still need the salvation of the Savior, who is Yeshua, to lead you into this paradise. So that's the idea. If one were a horrible murderer, well, the ordinance of the law would basically say, all right, fine, murder if you want, but we have a way to deal with you. If you take this life, we are going to punish you. It doesn't matter if you say you believe in Jesus. Yeah, we can't decide what happens to you after you die, but if you're going to commit a death sentence worthy punishment, the law says we're going to give you the death sentence. Then it's up to God. God can decide to bring you in or not.
But
And that's pretty much a belief.
if I may interject, I'll have to say, if so, holiness to a greater or lesser extent, righteous living is a requirement for salvation. Would you say that?
I wouldn't go as far to say that it's 100% a requirement, more that when it says Jesus will judge you multiple times in the New Testament, Christ says he is the judge, the epistles say he is the judge, God is sending Christ to be the judge, etc., etc. What is he exactly judging you on? If you just believe in him and you go straight to heaven, there's no space to judge. Why would he need to judge you before you go there? The judgment is clearly based on the kind of person you were in this life. A lot of Muslims say, this worldly life is a test. I wouldn't necessarily disagree with that. I would say this is a test, but it doesn't imply some neoplatonic spaceship paradise either. But it does. There is a test going on. So when Christ says
the test to remain righteous in the wake of all the sin that surrounds you.
Exactly, and isn't that the original form of jihad anyway? It's
the
struggle.
Right. That is jihad.
So that's the whole purpose. So if Jesus is the judge, he's clearly judging you on something, and it's not, I'm going to judge you to see if you believe in me hard enough. It's what kind of person you were. That's why in all the Gospels, Jesus says there's the parable of the sheep. Well, there's many parables regarding sheep, but one of them is he says that there's the people on my left who are goats, and the ones on my right are my sheep. And the sheep I will bring into paradise because they fed me and clothed me. And the sheep on the right say, when do we do that? And Jesus said, whenever you fed, one of the less fortunate, like the homeless or the sick, it's as if you were feeding and clothing me. But to the ones on the left, I say, you will not enter eternal life. And they say, wait a minute, didn't we do all these great things to impress you? And Jesus says, no, because you ignored the ones who were persecuted in society, it's as if you were ignoring me. So you don't get to go to the eternal paradise. So clearly he's teaching you have to do something. You have to, based on who you are, you'll get into paradise, not just by saying, I believe in Jesus, that's it.
Well, it's not just. I would go on to say that I think the most consistent Christians, the people who really, really believe that Jesus Christ has paid the wages for my sins. They're the most sinful people of all. Why would I not be? If I believed, and if I genuinely believed that this man washed away my sins, why would it not be a license for me to sin as much as possible?
Well, because the gospel, I think they're misreading the gospel and they're believing whatever the pastor says in church. They're presenting it as if this is like you've been cleansed for all sins in the future as well, whereas that's not really the case. What Jesus does for the atonement is that the concept of sacrificial atonement in the Old Testament is that if you had sinned, the punishment is death. Well, to circumnavigate that or circumvent that, because God is not just going to keep killing people all day long, he allows them to put that atonement punishment onto an animal and offer it to him. He later says in the Psalms that he actually doesn't desire the sacrifice at all. He just wishes people would not sin. That's his ultimate desire, that people would not sin. But anyway, Jesus is like the Passover lamb. He's the final one that saves you from this punishment of death and from this, because everyone is going to sin at some point. So Jesus is the one who stops these atonements, and he washes over you and gives you the ability to have a life. Even though you have sinned, you will not be killed for it. That doesn't mean you're going to heaven. So any Christians who are believing, Jesus sacrificed for me, I'm going straight to heaven, they're clearly ignoring all the multiple verses where Christ says, well, first of all, Christ is the judge. So like I covered earlier, what is he judging if everyone's fine in the first place? Second of all, Jesus says you have to keep his commandments if you love him, and his commandments are all to do with honoring God, being a righteous person, and the law of Moses. So
Well, these degenerate Christians, I would just think that they're being, and I have a respect for those who don't go down that road, those who live a godly life, aside from the fact that they ascribe a partnership, they call Jesus God and the Son of God, but at least insofar as how they live their life, I have respect for that, these more conservative-minded Christians. But those degenerate Christians, I think that they're being consistent with the theology that Paul taught. If I am not justified by works of the law, but by faith and faith alone, then there's works of the law includes even those minor things like circumcision, and it also includes major things like not being a murderer.
Right. Well, this
Right?
justification. Oh, sorry. You go ahead, and then I'll respond again.
Yeah, if I am justified not by works of the law, then that to me is just free reign to not keep any of the laws within the Old Testament, including those which we would deem as more severe.
Right. Well,
And
again,
we don't have this problem within the Quran. The Quran is very clear that I have to believe in one God, and also there has to be righteous works accompanied with it, and that is how I attain my salvation.
Right. Well, the answer again would be this kind of dual covenant that you are still going to be judged, but that your salvation itself, the idea of the possibility of you being saved, does not have to do with the type of law that you're doing. So the reason that's brought up by Paul in his letters is that people were saying, okay, great, Jesus did this sacrifice, but I'm going to go try extra hard at the Torah law, and maybe that'll get me into heaven without me even needing to care about anything Jesus said. So a lot of his epistles are aimed at these kind of people who are saying, these works, if I do them, if I do these good deeds enough, and I'm super intense about the Torah, and I do it to a level that even surpasses what God asks of me, he will surely let me into heaven. And where Paul is saying, no, you don't really get to decide whether you're getting your justification. This justification, this potential, I would say, not the ability to enter heaven, but the potential to enter heaven is based on Christ. Whereas
So you're saying
that,
it's a necessary precondition to believe in Jesus Christ, but it's not a sufficient precondition.
right, because beyond that, Jesus is still judging you. And I don't want to say it like a fifth time, but obviously if he's judging you, there has to be something to judge you on. It can't just be like, great, you believed in me, hop in. Because A, he says the way is narrow and most won't find it. And B, if you love him, keep his commandments. So, and there's a lot of other verses I'm just paraphrasing. But yes, I would say that the salvation is giving you it's the necessary precondition. So Paul is saying you can't just go out doing the law times 10 and think you're going to skip the Messiah. You're going to skip over him and then just go straight to paradise. You have to believe in him. You have to follow what he wants you to do. But beyond that, he's still going to judge you on what kind of person you were in this life.
Right, so then there would really be a limitation to how much Jesus can wash away of my sins if it requires some righteousness on my end. He can't, if genuinely my sins are washed away, if I have a clean record, then I should be able to enter heaven or the garden. But if I enter in as a wicked, horrible man who believed that Jesus died for my sins, then his blood wouldn't be enough to wash away all those sins. How much righteousness would I need to have within me in order for his blood to work to wipe me clean so I can enter into the kingdom.
Well, here's the thing. It's washing away the sins in a similar way to how, especially in the apostolic churches, baptism washes away all the sins that you had done previously and it makes you pure. But then from there on out, you still have to live a godly life. So I would say that's kind of a good analogy for the salvation that Christ gives as well. Like he's washing away the predetermined punishment, which is if you do one sin, the punishment is death. Well, he's taking the place of all those animals, so you don't have to do this big atonement anymore. He's the atonement, but you still have to repent and be a decent person. It's not that Jesus' salvation, the salvation of Christ, is incapable of getting you into heaven. It's more that you yourself are incapable of getting yourself into heaven because you were given this free chance by Christ and you still blew it because on top of everything, you were a horrible person and you didn't obey any kind of morality. So clearly it's not just, okay, he died, therefore I get to go to heaven immediately. More like he died, therefore now I can get to heaven. And from there, are we going to be good people who abide by righteousness? Or are we going to be wicked people? Because the wicked people are still going to be punished. And that's also kind of the justification for why the Catholics came up with the purgatory. Because they were saying, yeah, we know we have the salvation, but what about people who are really good, but not bad enough to go to hell, but not good enough to immediately go to heaven? And they were purged in this painful purgatorium for, who knows, maybe 10, 20 years, and then you would go to heaven. So it's like a temporary punishment.
Yeah, like a correctional facility.
Yeah, I don't believe in that concept, but that's what they came up with.
Yeah, but when I understand why people who come from a Christian faith, they will give it that interpretation. But when I read, let's say, passages like Galatians 2:16, when he says, "Yet we know that a person is not justified by works of the law, but through faith in Jesus Christ. So also we have believed in Christ Jesus in order to be justified by faith in Christ and not by works of the law, because by works of the law no one will be justified." This to me is, and I get that there are responsible Christians out there who won't take it that way, but I think he has opened up Pandora's box to a lot of degeneracy. Because he really has encompassed the whole law there. He said nobody is justified by works of the law. So that includes, like I said, many things, including major and minor sins.
What would you say to, maybe you haven't watched all this material because it's a massive playlist, but what would you say in general to Drake's theology that Paul is not teaching against the law, that these kind of verses are referring to this kind of keeping the law as a salvation rather than a covenant with God on earth for stability, order, discipline, etc.? Like, what would you say to his belief?
I think it's mental gymnastics, so working around what Paul clearly says. But I understand why he's doing it. If he's going to accept Paul, you're going to have to give it that interpretation.
Right,
but ever since the beginning, when I read Paul, and I've tried to read him as objectively as possible, I wanted to be a Christian for the longest time. I just got the impression that basically I can live my life however I want as long as I have faith that Jesus died for my sins, because I'm not responsible to keep works of the law. And that belief to me is horrendous. I think we have to live a righteous, godly life in order to see the garden.
Right. Well, what I did want to bring up, and the fact that I brought up Drake's work, is that I guess logically, if he had such a problem with Paul, it would make the most sense for him to simply reject Paul. But he hasn't done that, and instead he's written a lot on why Paul did not get rid of the law. There's actually, and obviously we're in the middle of talking, so there's no way for you to watch this while we're talking, but there is a decent documentary, and take it with a bit of grain of salt, because this documentary is made by a bunch of liberal British scholars. But I'm going to give it to you in the chat. No timestamp because the entire thing is relevant. There it is. Basically, this documentary is about the real story of Paul, and basically they argue that Paul himself does not ever teach to get rid of the Torah and that he's taken out of context. I am not 100% familiar with all of Paul's epistles. I'm much more familiar with the Torah and the Gospel. So I would have to read a lot more on Paul's epistles to be able to accurately respond to why he's taken out of context or what is the greater context. But I do know that there are some elements that have definitely been taken out of context with him, such as when he says, don't do any kind of sexual activity. Really what he's actually saying in the proper translation is not to use a woman for sexual activity, as in, don't use a woman like some kind of a prostitute, but rather to be able to restrain yourself and hopefully have a holy marriage. The same applies to when he says, if you're unmarried, stay unmarried, or I wish I were to stay unmarried with all of you, or I wish you were all unmarried. He's writing to people who are about to be persecuted by the Romans. So he's arguing it's better for you to be able to escape from them if you do not have wives and children running around with you. This is kind of a tenuous time period. So
Yeah,
given
in
that
light of the
context,
present distress.
right. So he's not saying, I don't want anyone to ever be married. Let's all just transform into eunuchs. He's really saying it may be easier for you to not have a wife given this condition that we're in. That's one example of him taken a little out of context. And same with the Acts 15. But I will read up more on Paul in case we have another discussion. We can talk about him more in depth. But I
Lord
do,
willing, I would love to have another discussion.
yeah. So I did ask you like a ton of questions. Do you have any more for me? I've got a little bit more time.
Let me think. Let me see if I have any in my notes.
Okay.
Let's see. Where do you?
Oh, sorry. Go ahead.
Yeah, where do you stand with respect to your Christology? Do you see Jesus as God, or are you now more of a semi-Aryan? What is your Christology?
Right. So my Christology has always been, even from the very start of doing my Orthodox Christianity apologetics on my channel, has always been leaning more towards how the ante-Nicene fathers would communicate it. I didn't use that label, but it was always leaning more towards that. And Dr. Bo Branson would agree on this as well. That God is synonymous with the Father pretty much, and that the Son and Spirit are co-eternal and coexistent with Him. And that's the way that I've elucidated it for most of my theological history, which is why I've actually done, not to humor myself too much, but why I've done well against people who are not Christian in a way that's better than the average Catholic and Protestant, and even the average Orthodox who doesn't know this theology the way I do. As for now, I was kind of in the inquiring phase on Drake's platform, so there's still a lot for me to learn, but my theology was always consistent with the ante-Nicene fathers and kind of a simplified monarchical Trinitarianism for sure.
Okay, yeah. And another thing I want to ask you, where did that question go? Let me pull it back up. What was it? You know when something's in your mind and it just escapes you at the wrong time?
Yeah, I get that all the time, no worries.
Yeah. Total injustice, departure. Oh, I guess while I'm recalling my thoughts of what I want to ask you, for my critics, or, specifically people like Hans and from Drake's camp, who, they asked the question, you asked me this one before, how could I be so arrogant to think that I know so much better than all these people who have spent their whole life studying the Quran? And I responded back by saying, these Hadith scholars, and I responded back by saying, how do you think you can know so much better than all these church fathers and people who've written the ecumenical councils and they've participated in them and they've studied the Bible their whole life in the original language? How do you think you could know better? But I would also just like to point them to my video that I made. It's the most popular video on my channel, the one that went semi-viral, at least for my standards. It's called A Defense of Prophet Muhammad, David Wood, and Hadith Exposed. And you'll see from there, I demonstrate very, very clearly that the Quran is to be followed alone and that the Hadith is contradictory to the Quran's own statement. So you can watch that one. It's a 2-hour documentary, not only taking the wind out of David Wood, but also showing the Hadith as a superfluous add-on to the doctrine.
I see. Well, the main response, because I was discussing this with Hans the other day, I was saying, what if he asks, how do we do this with the Bible, or how have you and Drake done the same thing? And basically Hans's answer was, the difference is that the Hadith corpus is so massive, whereas the Bible can be digested in a manner of, it would still take years, but you could realistically go through all of it, read it with kind of an unbiased look. Whereas Hans was asking me, okay, he's looking at Sahih Bukhari, what about Sahih Muslim, and even the ones who are not as verifiable. I think one of his polemics against you was also saying, that you don't know the original Arabic context of all the writings by these theologians or the Quran itself.
No, but I do know. Well, I don't need to study every single last hadith that's ever been written and compiled to know that it's false. I have, read textbooks on this subject. I have consulted with scholars, and I've seen their methodology, and it contradicts plainly the Quran. That's my main issue. The whole hadith corpus, the entire idea of hadith, this idea that there's going to be this extra text coming later on, there's going to be this dual text system where we have the Quran and also this hadith, and both of these are going to inform the Muslim faith. This is a flat out contradiction to the Quran. Right from then and there, I reject it.
Right. Well, I forgot to mention this earlier. Another point that Hans had, he wanted me to ask you. He's saying that all of the interpretations of the Hadith, some of them he would argue do move more toward Neoplatonism, are not from a bunch of Greek philosophy, because many of the Hadith were written at a time before all the Greek philosophy had been transmitted, and that it's getting all of this interpretation entirely from the Quran. Therefore, the Quran at base has to be teaching some kind of a transcendental or Neoplatonic issue. And then, of course, he mentioned the nafs thing with the soul and a couple of the verses you guys had gone over last time.
I would say this that perhaps there is. I haven't read all the hadith. I don't think there's any way anybody could really read all the hadith. But
I'd agree on
if
that.
yeah, there's so much of this nonsense. But if you have found some hadith which wax a little bit Neoplatonic, a little bit metaphysical and Hellenistic, just understand that this kind of immaterial metaphysical philosophy, it's not only from the Greeks. This has existed all over the pagan world. So God knows where this stuff came from, right? The Native Americans, they had a similar view. The Egyptians, they had that kind of view as well. I mean, this is all over the world. This is characteristic of paganism. This kind of metaphysical, abstract, immaterial philosophy.
Like an
The
entirely
occult,
invisible world.
yeah,
And
yeah. The occult it's everywhere. So who knows where they got this stuff from? But it's not from the Quran, and I've demonstrated it copiously. The Quran teaches that God is a physical, literal, concrete, corporeal being. You can read my Flat Earth Manifesto for that.
okay,
The whole paradigm of the Quran, how it describes the garden, how it describes hell, everything is within physical parameters. The term immaterial or incorporeal reality, it appears nowhere within the Quran.
right.
So wherever
Well,
they got this from, you cannot attribute it to the Quran.
okay. On the topic of God's finite form, we had gone over it earlier on the talk. What kind of a form is this? And not to get too mentally masturbatory here, but obviously, just in a vague term, is it like a humanoid form, or is it just there's no way to know, but he just has some kind of a form? Because in the
Uh,
Bible, in Genesis, there's the concept that God made man in his image. So there's the assumption that maybe he doesn't have hands and fingers and toes and whatever, but there's some kind of a masculineness to God that is what he made the image of Adam out of,
there's a
kind of as a
likeness.
tribute to himself. Yes,
Uh, I would say just, I would tread this with caution because I don't want to ascribe anything false to God, which I have no knowledge of. But according to the Quran, God sits in his throne. So I think you would need a certain physical disposition to sit yourself in a throne, right?
yeah,
Uh,
I
you
agree with
know,
that.
it says God has hands. It says that the God is massive. He is absolutely ginormous. He's the biggest thing ever because God says that the whole of the heavens and the earth, they will be his handful on the day of judgment. And he says that his throne overspreads the heavens and the earth. So God is without a doubt the biggest thing ever. And that's really all I can say.
But he's
It
not
gives
like wrapping around the entire like this 12 billion light year cosmos transcendental.
no, no,
Okay.
no. That's a whole really not physic but a metaphysic which I don't accept and neither does the Quran teach.
Because there are some Muslims who would go as far to say, well, because God is so transcendental, you can't compare him to anything, even genders. He's not really strictly male, even though we use the male pronoun when talking about him. And, he's outside of time, and you can't even talk about him because any word you say is not accurate to describe him. So
God is
it
not a
gets,
male. They have it backwards. It's not that God is a male. It's just God has, out of all the creation that God has made, the male, in some sense, possesses the most likeness to him.
I see. But he's not genderless, obviously.
We refer to him as a he.
Yes.
Yeah,
Okay.
that's what I would say.
Okay, that's we don't have to go any further than that, obviously. But I guess what I'm trying to say is you obviously see in Sunni Islam this transcendental, because a lot of them will say any word we say won't even do justice. And in fact, even the words of the Quran are like, I don't want to say maybe watered down or diluted for us humans to understand, but the true speech of God is like incomprehensible to human, auditory capabilities. They
Yeah,
make these
obviously
kind of
there's
arguments.
there is accommodation certainly, but
Sure.
I think when we start going into these questions of what is really the speech of God like, and I mean I think we're starting to get into mental masturbation again,
Oh,
and
I do
it's
have to ask. Sorry, go ahead, and then I have one more question for you.
no, say what you're saying.
So on the topic of the crucifixion, very, very big topic. A lot of Muslims, the Sunni, argue the substitution theology. What, like, as in God put Simon or someone else on there, or Judas. The Shia don't say that. The Shia say he was on the cross, but God saved him before he died. What does, in your theology, what happened to Jesus or Isa? How was he crucified, or was he not crucified?
I'm agnostic on the issue because the Quran doesn't go into the details of how it was carried about.
But
All
does it
it's
say that he was crucified, but he survived, or he just
No.
flat out wasn't?
All it says is that Jesus was not. They did not kill him, did not crucify him, but it was made to appear that way. How
Okay.
that carried out in history, whether he was put on the cross and then he got away, or whether it was somebody else who substituted, or something else entirely, God knows best. God knows best. It
What
doesn't
do
go into the
you
details on that.
what do you think of the Ibadi sect out of Oman?
Ibadi sect, not familiar with them.
They're the third wing of Islam that no one ever talks about. There's only like 8 million of them. You have the Sunni, the Shia, and then the Omanis have their Ibadi sect. They're like a really, really old heresy from the peninsula.
What is their characteristics?
I know absolutely nothing about them, so let me look it up right now. This is going to be very vague. Differences between, let's see. Unlike traditional Sunni Islam, but like the modern Salafi movement, Ibadis do not have Sufi orders and they reject the veneration of saints. Historically, the views of Sufis were not well regarded in Ibadi literature, with Ibadi scholars like Al-Munthiri writing anti-Sufi works. However, mystical devotional practices reminiscent of Sunni Sufism were traditionally practiced by some scholars. Let me see. They do have a system of hadith, but it's different. It's the primary Ibadi collection of hadiths is the 12th century Tartib al-Musnad, comprising 1005 hadiths, and it is divided into 4 books. The first 2 are narrations by Jabir ibn Zayd, a student of Aisha. The 3rd book is by, yeah, so basically it's just a lot of, it is still hadith, but I'm trying to get to the theological viewpoints real quick. Here it is. They teach the human knowledge of God is innate through the use of reason rather than being learned. Therefore, a Quranic verse that appears to contradict with human reason must be metaphorically reinterpreted in light of reason rather than being taken as fact. It is forbidden to decide matters of religious belief by deference to a cleric or human authority. The attributes of God are not distinct from his essence, they teach. Mercy, power, wisdom, and other divine attributes are merely different ways to describe the single unitary essence of God. Some Ibadis believe the Quran was created. While these Ibadis uphold the fact that essential speech is a way to describe his essence, they do not believe that the Quran is identical to his essence. So they don't believe in the kind of uncreated Sunni thing. And the final point, they interpret anthropomorphic references to God in the Quran symbolically rather than literally. Therefore, God does not actually have hands, a face, a throne, or other physical attributes, as he cannot be perceived by human senses. Thus, they believe that Muslims will not see God on the day of resurrection, a belief shared with the Shia, but not the Sunni. That's the main thing, and they follow the Ash'ari position of occasionalism. Very, very, like, small minority sect.
So
Only in Oman.
I would agree with them insofar as there isn't this eternal, uncreated Quran existing alongside God, but I would disagree when all of these anthropomorphic mentions of God in the Quran. I don't think these are symbolic; these are literal. Because not only does God tell us about His throne, He tells us that's the size of His throne. We actually get a physical metric. He says that His throne overspreads the heavens and the earth. So
Right.
I don't think these are allegorical. These are literal. God is telling us. God is not trying to confuse us with these types of statements.
I see.
And of course, I'll disagree with them because they accept their own collection of hadiths. And this is another thing, actually, I want to bring up quickly before I guess we wrap this up.
Sure.
Is I want to say that just look at the so-called Muslim world. Look at the Sunnis. Look at the Shias. Look at the Ibadis. The hadith has been the primary source of controversy. These people, they do not disagree on what verses are in the Quran. The primary source of their controversy, and this is admitted by the foremost even hadith scholars, is the hadith. The Sunnis have their own hadith, the Shias have their own hadith, the Ibadis have their own hadith. Even within the Sunni, the Sahih hadiths, the so-called best hadith, people wonder which of these are we really able to accept, which not, which of these are false narrations that Bukhari and Muslim didn't really see through. They let them get into their works. This has been the primary source of confusion, and that is why I reject all of it, because not only does it contradict the Quran, but I see this as the main problem in the so-called Muslim world.
I see. Yeah, I wasn't sure whether they had followed the Hadith. I really know nothing about them other than they're in really only Oman and part of Algeria. They were once more numerous in North Africa, so they once had a little bit more glory, like how the Shia were once a lot more influential than they are today by pure numbers. I did send you a link to some of their history. I just thought I'd
Yeah.
bring them up because it's such a red herring. No one ever talks about them. I just thought, well, we're on the topic of like fringe Islamic beliefs. I may as well ask about these guys. But let me know what you think about them.
Lord willing.
So I guess the next step would be we had a good conversation, and you did not have a great conversation. You and Drake did not really get along. Would there ever be a time where we could possibly all talk again, or would you be against that?
I would be open to it, no problem, so long as things remain respectful and cordial. And I think Drake was being dishonest in that debate, especially towards the end. You know, he was trying to frame me and say, oh, I'm not storytelling because I'm quoting a historical document and you deliberately misrepresented me. I did not deliberately misrepresent you. There are many historical documents on pen and paper with ink on them that are stories. There's the Epic of Gilgamesh, and I didn't misrepresent him at all in that way. I think he was just looking for a way to end the debate for the night because he was already on for 3 hours and he just wanted to go on with the rest of his night.
Well, in his defense, I would say when Drake uses the word storytelling, he doesn't necessarily mean it has to be a narrative or a story. Storytelling is kind of, in his view, the abductive reasoning that the West and Western science primarily uses. So if you can't explain something, there's got to be some kind of like lore they can pull out with, like other than you got the Big Bang and panspermia. These are all examples of storytelling. Obviously, I wouldn't ever read the panspermia fiction to my children at night, but I wouldn't consider that like a tale. I think when he says storytelling, he meant kind of inference to the best explanation and then kind of making up the rest along the way, abductive reasoning. I think
That's not a story is just a tale or narrative, and when I say story, I'm just referring to any really fictional proposition, any fictional narrative.
right. But that's why I thought you guys were talking past each other at the end, because when he uses that in his debates or videos, he's specifically talking about abductive storytelling, not just any old story. So
Yeah.
I don't think you guys were agreeing on the definition of the word.
Well, maybe if he took the time to listen, he would understand what I'm actually saying instead of interrupting me.
All right. Well, to close this out, I'm hopeful that we will all be able to talk again at some point. I know, obviously, that Hans will know a lot more about. He'll be able to talk to you about the Quran more than myself because I'm not, 100% familiar with it. Though I have a good amount of experience dealing with Muslims from my time in the theology scene. But he'll know more from someone who was raised Muslim, and then maybe you could talk to him about why he left Islam. He's given me kind of a basic story, but maybe he'll tell you somewhat more of the theological reasons. One last thing, have you ever seen the historicist interpretation of Revelation that
Yeah,
Drake?
I've listened to a little bit of Drake's. Basically, they view the Book of Revelation as kind of types and symbols of events that play out through world history.
Right, some are preterist, meaning they had happened, and some are futurist in that they will happen. Depending on the church, some are full preterist, meaning, oh, everything happened, nothing else is going to be in the future.
We're in the
And others
kingdom.
are, yeah, and others are full futurists, saying nothing has happened, it's all coming out. So they're in the historicist, which is, most of it is historical. Obviously, some parts are going to be about the future. They do have a good, they do have a really interesting one showing Islam in the Book of Revelation, particularly the Arab invaders. Obviously, the word Islam is not in the Book of Revelation, but the implication is that the
That
locusts,
political zeitgeist, you mean?
the locust of Revelation 9. Let me pull it up now. Actually, let's see, Revelation 9. The locust from the bottomless pit, and it says, and the fifth angel sounded. I'm not going to read all of it, but just a little bit so you get the idea. And I saw a star fallen from heaven to the earth. To him was given the key to the bottomless pit. And he opened the bottomless pit, and smoke arose out of the pit like the smoke of a great furnace. So the sun and the air were darkened because of the smoke of the pit. Then out of the smoke locusts came upon the earth, and to them was given power as the scorpions of the earth have power. They were commanded not to harm the grass of the earth, nor any green thing, or any tree, but only those men who do not have the seal of God on their foreheads. I'll give you why they think this is about the Arab invaders after.
Yeah.
And they were not given authority to kill them, but to torment them for 5 months. The torment was like the torment of a scorpion when it strikes a man. In those days, men will seek death and will not find it. They will desire to die, and death will flee from them. The shape of the locust was like horses prepared for battle. On their heads were crowns of something like gold, and their faces were like the faces of men. They had hair like women's hair, and their teeth were like lions' teeth. And they had breastplates like breastplates of iron, and the sound of their wings was like the sound of chariots with many horses running into battle. They had tails like scorpions, and there were stings in their tails. Their power was to hurt men 5 months. And they had as king over them the angel of the bottomless pit, whose name in Hebrew is Abaddon, but in Greek he has the name Apollyon. One woe is past, behold, still two more woes are coming after. So I'm not going to go through it line by line, but basically the story is these locusts represent the Arab invaders. The 5 months is very interesting because in the book of Revelation, days, weeks, and months are used in a prophetic way, and that they're not literal days, but they correspond to actual time. But it's done in a way that is not 5 months. So 5 months is a set number of years. They have this measured out. I don't have it off the top of my head, but it does actually correspond to the Arab invasions up into Gaul. And then as the 5th prophetic month ends, the Arab invasions reach their climactic point. As for they will, let's see. As for they had hair like women's hair and their teeth were like lions' teeth. This is kind of a reference to how some of the Bedouins in Arabia did actually have hair that they would not cut. The iron armor, they would say, is the armor of the Arabs at the time. They're likened to the sound of chariots. And the reason it says that the men wanted to die but will not find it, and they were not given authority to kill them, it's interpreted as destroying the Roman Christian Empire, specifically Eastern Rome, how the Arabs completely removed the Levant from the Byzantine Empire, from the Byzantine Empire, but they do not completely give the death blow to the Roman Christians. So this is all interpreted as these are the Arab invaders. And finally, the mark on their forehead, the seal of God, is likened to, I believe it's Leviticus, where God says the law of Moses is like a mark on their head. So that's their interpretation for Islam. They have it in more of a line-by-line detail, but I'm just giving you the basics of it.
That's interesting, but I would say my main concern with the book of Revelation is I think pretty much every interpretation of the book of Revelation is subjective. How could it not be, considering the language and the symbolism is so cryptic? Like, there's no way of really proving that you have the correct view of Revelation.
Yeah, a lot of people say that because if you just look up interpretation of Revelation,
it's very
on
occult.
YouTube,
The book is very occult in a sense. It's allegorical. The meanings are veiled, and it leaves so much open to interpretation.
right. Well, the justification for these kind of interpretations is not just reading it point blank, but kind of seeing what are these prophetic months, what do they lead to, are there any events in history that correspond, et cetera, et cetera. Drake has a whole page on it, so I'm not doing it justice. I was just giving you the basic idea of what is taught there. But yeah, definitely the book of Revelation is something we should all talk about the next time we meet. I'm going to speak to Drake and Hans tonight, probably, and when we're done. And I'll just say we should definitely schedule something. We'll see if it's another discussion or maybe they'll desire kind of a debate, but I'll let you know either way.
Yeah.
I did really enjoy talking. And,
As did I.
It was very nice. So is this live stream or are you just uploading this later?
Yeah, I'm just recording it now, and I'll upload it later, Lord wills.
Okay. Very nice. Very nice.
And one more thing I want to say, I guess, before we sign off, regarding my detractors who say I'm very liberal or whatnot, and that criticism has been on my mind, and I would just reiterate the point of ask yourself the question regarding my views on race, where I don't see race as a fundamental point that I'm going to make divisions between me and other people, and I would just ask again, who do you really want to be around? People who are the same race as you but atheist savages, or people, let's say, who are black or a different race but they believe the exact same things as you? And also understand that we get along with people who have the same culture as us, and I would ask you to consider the same races of people in different environments. So like black people in Jamaica versus black people in Africa, totally different demeanor. A black person from Jamaica might want to be with an Indian Jamaican as opposed to another black person who looks like them from Africa. Just consider that many of these things are culture.
Right, but actually one thing I would counter to that, even though I don't disagree with you on principle, would be, wouldn't that be most applicable here in the West, where we're in very diverse areas and like random people from across the world have all been kind of spit out in random parts of America. Whereas the implication in the rest of the world is, you asked me would I want to be with people who believe in God like me, or would I want to be with a bunch of like atheist degenerates? Well, if I'm actually in the old country and I'm in the Arab world, most of the people are going to believe in God, even though we're going to disagree on how that is. You get the main point, right? If I were Sunni Muslim, I would just say, well, you know what? I'm just going to go move to Saudi Arabia, and therefore everyone will be like me. But that, again, is also kind of cultural, isn't it? It's not just racial.
Yeah, well, I mean, I was just simply giving that analogy to isolate race and then to isolate ideology, doctrine, and behavior, and to
Sure.
see which one is of more significance in your life.
Yeah, of course. I mean,
That was what the thought experiment was for.
yeah, that makes sense. Well, I'm glad you answered the part about the liberal stuff because it seems like what you're doing is basically whatever the Quran says, I'm going to do that. And if some extremely conservative guy in Saudi Arabia is basing his whole life on the Hadith, obviously I'm going to disagree with him.
Yeah,
That's what you're saying.
I'll give one more example. Let's say, for example, liberals they agree that women should be allowed to show their hair in public, right? Sure,
Sure.
I agree with liberals on that, but not on the principle of them being liberal. I agree because the Quran doesn't say anything that women have to wear hijabs, right? So sure, I agree with liberals on that women should be allowed to show their hair in public. Doesn't mean I agree with them on everything, but just on that point. And on the reverse end, I would agree with more conservative hadithans saying that women should cover their body. They need to draw a covering over their behinds and over their chests. I agree with them on that point, but not because they're conservative hadithans, but just because that's what the Quran says as well.
Sure. So
My
actually,
loyalties are only to the Quran
I see.
and
One
those who
quick
follow the
thing.
same.
So what is the dress code, if you give me a simplified answer, based only on the Quran? You're saying the hijab and all the kind of, well, at least for women, that's completely from the Hadith. Isn't it like the episode with Omar and Muhammad, and he says, hey, you need to veil these women, or something like that? I'm just paraphrasing it.
The dress code in the Quran is very simple, and my wife follows it as well. It's just you need to have the God says to lengthen your garment. So basically, this whole tight jeans thing, yoga pants, where you see the person's behind as they're walking, and it's very tantalizing to a lot of men. That's not proper. They need to have a lengthened garment, so a dress of some kind, and draw a covering over their bosom, so their chest should not be showing as well.
Right.
So as long as they have a lengthened garment and as long as their chest is covered, they're okay.
Okay, so anything like the niqab and the hijab as well, they're just complete innovations in the Hadith?
Yeah, no need for the hijab. Now, my wife, she wears a hijab pretty much every day when she goes out and head wraps. She doesn't really show her hair. And it's not because we feel it's religiously necessary, but it's just because it's a genuinely beautiful garment that women can wear. And we find it quite appealing, right?
Right.
It's a beautiful thing. It shows modesty and chastity. But we understand it's not required. It's not a sin for her to go out in public with her hair showing.
Okay.
But she wears it anyways, though.
One last thing. I keep saying that because I keep coming up with new questions while you're here. What about going to a masjid? Do you guys go to anyone, or do you just say, hey, I'm not going to go to any of these because it's like all Hadith nonsense?
I would love to, but sadly I don't because these people don't follow the same religion as me. They don't. And here's the thing, I wouldn't mind, let's say a Quran alone mosque were to start up, in the city next to me or whatever. I would gladly go there, even if I disagreed with the imam or the preacher on a few points. That's not a reason why I wouldn't go to a mosque. It's just the only reason I wouldn't go to a mosque or religious institution is if I genuinely feel that the foundations of the institution are completely different to the worldview I hold, and that's exactly how I feel about these Sunni and Shia mosques, so I don't go.
Right.
I would love to. I would love to, but I can't because they don't follow the Quran, these people. It's an Arab religion, Hadith religion.
I see. Well, actually, it would also be Persianized because of the Hadith.
Persianized,
Be
yeah.
very Persianized.
I don't
A
mean to
lot of
jock your
that.
style when I say that.
No, that's fine. A lot of people say a lot of the intelligence of Islam comes from the Persian philosophers, and that they use it kind of in a derogatory way. A lot of anti-Muslim debaters will say, "Oh, you know what? The Arabs had a savage religion. The Persians civilized it."
Yeah, people will take that racial charge, even with the people of the Indian subcontinent. Sunnis, they'll be like, oh yeah, all this stuff about, and they are kind of right. They're like, all this stuff about Hadith rejection, it mainly comes from the Indian subcontinent. It's not even Arabian. They'll almost use that as like a derogatory term.
Are there a lot of Quranists? Like, I would assume that a lot are diaspora because maybe it's not so safe to run around Arabia and South Asia declaring that you don't like the Hadith. So would a lot of
Yeah.
them be diaspora?
Yeah, based on what I've seen in the Quran alone community I'm familiar with, the number one demographic is Pakistani. Like I told you, my mother, she rejects the authority of the Hadith, and my grandfather, her father, he also rejects the authority of the Hadith. There's been a tradition within the Indian subcontinent of rejecting and being suspicious of Hadiths. Even some of the
I
founders of
see.
the country have been suspicious of Hadith. So it's kind of it's within our culture. Even within
What
the Ahmadiyyas, they don't go the full way and reject all Hadith, but they reject even Hadith which are Sahih.
what about on that topic, what about Jesus and the resurrection? And the nominal Sunni believes that the Messiah will return, slay Dajjal, and set up the Sharia throughout the world. What is your interpretation of that?
These are all stories. There's no Dajjal, Antichrist mentioned in the Quran. Neither is there a Mahdi, and nor is there this idea that Jesus is going to come back on the last day and fight this amazing heroic war. None of this is within the Quran. God says that, what this has done is it's left a lot of people passive and lazy. They're awaiting Jesus to come down and the Mahdi to come down, and then they're going to spring into action and be super heroic. No. God says he doesn't change the fate of a people until they change what is in their souls, by meaning until they change what is in themselves. We can't sit here and wait for a savior figure to descend from heaven. We have to take accountability for our lives and change the problems for ourselves with
I
faith in
see.
God.
What about let's see, do you follow all the wudu practices, the washing?
Yeah, and there is a wudu mentioned in the Quran. I have a different interpretation of how it's supposed to be used and when it's supposed to be used. But yeah, there is an ablution in the Quran, slightly different from the Hadithin, but it is there.
Okay. What would you say if I were a Quranist? I showed up and I said, hey, we agree the hadith is wrong, but I disagree with all of your interpretations. How do we know which one of us is correct? Because that was brought up to me as well.
Then
That goes for Bible people as well.
yeah,
So,
I would simply say then I would try to reason with you, and if we have reached a point where we're just not agreeing with each other, I would say we leave the matter with the Most High. God will be the judge between us. That's the Quranic position.
what about oh, this
It's
is what
not my job to make everybody agree with me. It's my job to preach what I honestly believe and understand to be the truth, and then I leave the matter with the Most High.
I see. What would you say to the criticism of, and then after this, I probably do have to head out, but what would you say to the criticism many hold that the Quran does not articulate the Trinity or Christianity properly, that it's basing it off kind of fringe heresies? I don't necessarily hold that position, by the way. There are others who do. Most Christians do. They say that the Quran does not understand the Trinity, it doesn't articulate it. Muhammad's the author and he didn't understand what it was, therefore the Quran's false when it attacks it.
Well, I'd have to see what specific verse are they talking about.
There's not actually too many verses in the Quran which discuss the Trinity. I think the main one is, and this is one I disagree with, by the way. The main one is when they say, do not say that Allah is a third of three. I actually disagree with Christians who use that because, and Dr. Bo Branson did a great piece on this, the Arab Christians were walking around saying that only one of the persons was really to be called God, the Father. So, though that was the Christianity that a lot of the Arabs were saying, because they had a simplistic monarchical trinity. But there is another verse, I think you'd mentioned it. It's that kind of vision of the future where God's talking to Jesus, and he says, did you take yourself and your mother as gods? That's one that people have a lot of issue with. They say, well, Christians don't believe Mary's a god. What on earth is the Quran talking about?
I think the Quran is talking about what is a natural progression of the Christian theology. And I would agree with the Catholics on this. Yeah, if you believe God the Father is God, and you believe Jesus is the Son of God and God himself, then Mary, who is his mother, by definition, she is the mother of God. She is a God herself.
The
I think the
Orthodox say the same thing, mother of God, but they don't say she's a god, that she's still immortal.
if you are the mother of God, by definition, that would make you a God as well.
How so?
Because God literally came from your womb. You you
Right,
you
but
you, you
she
share
didn't
you
make her.
share you share that with them, with him. God, if Jesus is God, God was literally dependent on your body to receive sustenance, and God was formed in your womb.
Well, they would say the human body was, not there's the distinction between like how Jesus is fully God, fully man. So his divine part, or divine, his fully godliness was never dependent on Mary. That's why
Saying
Nestorius, by the way, was saying we can't call her mother of God because the divine and the mortal are so separate that she really only gave birth to his human body. Therefore, she did not give birth to God. That's why she's Christotokos, not Theotokos. That's what Nestorius said.
But saying that a man is fully God and fully human, that just sounds to me like a contradiction. It's like saying the glass of water in front of me is 100% empty and also 100% full of water. So I would have logical disputes about that.
Right. Well, I think we've definitely gone way over how long I thought we'd talk, which I'm not complaining. I think we covered a lot of great ground here, but I will have to head off. Thanks for sticking around, and I will talk to Drake and Hans and see if maybe we can get either a discussion or maybe even a debate if you're up to that. Obviously, if there
I'm
was
not opposed to it.
we'd find one specific topic to focus on so there isn't red herrings flying all over. So maybe
I would honestly like, if we could, some moderation to the debate as well. Just because seeing as how things went last time, I think it'd be best if there was moderation, an objective person watching over the debate, letting me speak, letting him speak, etc.
well, not to humor myself too much, but maybe we could make this more simple if I were to moderate it. Obviously, I don't share your theology, but based on our conversation here, I think you could assume that I'd be fair enough to say, all right, it's Walid's turn, now it's Hans' turn, and no one's going to interrupt. And if one party's misunderstanding you, I could pause and explain, and vice versa.
I trust that you would be an impartial moderator. Yeah, I wouldn't object to that.
Then let me see if I can set something up. Otherwise, I will probably watch a part of this back on YouTube once is it live now or is it like fully? By the way, what's your handle on YouTube? Because whenever I search Eyes Wide Open, a bunch of like weird channels show up.
Yeah, I honestly don't know what the issue is with that. Well, why it shoves me to the bottom. Just type up Eyes Wide Open David Wood or something like that.
Oh, actually, if you just do @Eyes Wide Open, your channel will show up. Because that's the tag.
Yeah, I'm pretty bad with this technological navigation, so thank you for that.
Yeah, no problem. Okay, so I see your channel here. I'll probably take a look at everything once it's fully up there. But yeah, the last thing I'll leave you with. Did you do a video on that? Is that diaspora guy? What's his name? The Pakistani guy from London. He's always given these like Sigma grind set. Did you do a video on him? I think I see him here in one of your videos.
Hamza. Yeah, I've made a few videos on him because I found him interesting. What is his deal? Yeah, he's just a young, insecure Pakistani guy who ended up getting in shape and making lots of money and sleeping with a bunch of women, and now he's teaching other men to do the same who are down and out and down bad. Yeah. He just sells his content to a bunch of insecure incel teenagers. It's horrible.
It is horrible. Why is
it's just this like toxic manosphere stuff? It's horrible because it's not true masculinity. It's not. It's just this like boastful high school jock kind of thing.
I guess the last question would be, why do you think he's not religious?
Well, he's openly admitted he's an atheist. He doesn't believe in God.
Oh, I don't ever watch his nonsense, so I wouldn't know. All right. Well, thank you very much, and I will talk to them tonight and see if we can get some kind of I'll moderate it, of course, some kind of an official debate. Before I go, is there any topic in particular you'd like to talk to Drake or Hans about?
Not really. I guess he can bring his best criticisms of the Quran, and I can bring what I feel like are my most potent criticisms against the Bible.
Okay, I'll relay it with them and see what their desire would be.
And then exactly. Then the audience can decide which of us presented the better case.
Great. Okay, perfect. I'll talk to you later. Thanks again for the awesome conversation.
All right. Have a good night, Jim. Thank you.
You too. Bye.
See ya.